anime autopsy here, and we need to have a conversation about Luffy hearing ghosts, because I am genuinely convinced the community has taken one of the coolest ongoing mysteries in One Piece and turned it into spiritual white noise. Every time this man tilts his head and reacts to something no one else can hear, I open Twitter and there it is. Bro is literally talking to ghosts. Souls of the Sea moment. Destiny Chosen One Wi-Fi. And listen to me, I need you to understand how much that hurts me on a spiritual tax-audited level. You've seen the posts. Someone rips the panel of Luffy on Fishman Island hearing the Sea Kings, slaps it next to Roger doing the exact same thing in Oden's flashback, and the caption is just, Oda is insane, ghost comms 20 years apart, no context. No discussion of what the voice of all things is actually doing there. Just engagement bait. Or they grab Luffy on Zoo, clutching his head as Zunesha begs to fight back, and it's our boy as a medium now. Then in Wano, when he hears the Thousand Sunny crying out as it's about to be burned, suddenly the ship has a dead grandma's spirit or something. This is the level of analysis we're operating on. Is the thing. Saying he's talking to ghosts is not just wrong. It's boring. It takes a meticulously planned through line that Oda has been threading from Roger to Luffy to Momonosuke to literal world-shaking creatures, and it throws the whole category into the vaguest possible bucket. Destiny magic nonsense. It flattens the difference between spooky vibe and consistent, intentional system of communication that keeps showing up right before history punches through the surface of the story. And this is not a sin in the moral sense. Pattern-seeking monkey sees mysterious sound, screams ghosts, goes viral. This is normal. This is fine. I am also a pattern-seeking monkey. I have spent an actually embarrassing percentage of my adult life rereading these chapters, cross-referencing SBS answers, and trying to reverse engineer how this author outlines. I am not doing all that so we can shrug, call it ghost talk, and go home to another Luffy is literally Aang meme. Because when Luffy hears the Sea Kings, and Roger hears the same voices, and Oden feels something but can't decode it, and then years later Luffy and Momonosuke both pick up Zunesha's plea while only Momo can send a command back, that is a system. That is foreshadowing for an endgame mechanic, as around the season. So here's the provocation I need you to sit with for the next 2+ hours. Luffy is not communing with spirits. He is not a ghost radio. He is an antenna. He is picking up a broadcast that has been running mostly unheard for 800 years. And this video is going to walk through every panel, every impossible voice, every scrap of world building Oda has dropped, to prove that to you with receipts. So here's the thing. The reason this antenna idea even sounds weird to you is because our community has trained itself to file anything we don't immediately understand into the same junk drawer. Mysterious voice, ancient drumbeat, destiny. Giant elephant hearing your inner monologue from across the ocean. Sure magic, whatever. Close tab, post meme. This is not a sin. This is not some moral failing of the fandom. This is normal pattern seeking, monkey brain behavior. You hit something that doesn't fit your current category system. You slap a mystical sticker on it, and you move on to arguing about power levels. But if we do that with Luffy's voices, with Joy Boy, with the drums of liberation, we quietly erase the one person in this equation who actually knows the answers, the author. Because when you say, oh, Luffy just hears the souls of the world, and you stop there, you are accidentally saying, Oda did not plan a system here. You're saying this is vibes. You're saying this is a mood board. And that completely collides with the other thing you say about him every other week, which is that he's playing 10D chess with 25 years of foreshadowing and a notebook from 1997. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot praise the writing as hyper-intentional, then turn around and hand-wave the voice of all things as random spiritual nonsense. Either the Sea Kings at Fishman Island, echoing Roger's exact reaction in Oden's flashback, is a planned mechanical clue about an information network, or it is a coincidence with good music behind it. Those are different categories. They have different implications for how seriously we should read anything else in this story. And listen to me. The pattern is too consistent to be just destiny. Luffy hears the Sea Kings. Roger hears the same thing with the same framing. On Zoo, Luffy and Momonosuke both hear Zunesha, but only Momo can answer back. which tells you this isn't Ghost ASMR. This is a two-way channel. In Wano, Luffy hears the Thousand Sunny scream when Kaido's blast hits, which means even a ship can ping this network if it has a strong enough will attached to it. That's not random. That's a system Oda keeps stress testing in different contexts. So why does this matter? Why am I spending 2+ hours of my finite life and yours yelling about semantic differences between ghosts and signal? Because if everything is mystical destiny, then nothing is craft. If every unexplained phenomenon is just the will of the world, then there is no foreshadowing to decode, no machinery to uncover, no joy in realizing 10 arcs later that a throwaway reaction shot was an engineering diagram. And I need you to notice something about yourself here. You clicked on a multi-hour breakdown titled Luffy Isn't Hearing Ghosts. You are not the person who is satisfied with Oda will explain it in SBS LOL. You are the person who wants to see the gears. You want to know what category this belongs to, what rules it obeys, how it connects Fishman Island to Zoo, to Wano, to Marineford, without Oda ever putting a neon sign on it, which is exactly where this gets fun. Because once we stop calling it ghosts and start calling it a signal, a whole bunch of scenes you've been treating as isolated flavor text suddenly line up into a single transmission. In the Sea King's prophecy, Zunesha's crime, the drums of liberation over Onigashima, even that one moment at Marineford you probably forgot were all pings on the same network. And in the next section, we're going to pull those scenes out one by one and show you the wiring that's been under your nose since Fishman Island. So yes, this video is long. This is not a tight 2.0c minute Luffy as a radio lol theory you put on at 2x speed while doing dishes. We're going to be here for 2 hours and change, and I need you to understand why before you decide I've finally lost it. Here's the thing. I'm not just doing the pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast routine with a couple of panels and a spooky soundtrack. We're doing an audit, a systematic scene-by-scene review of every single voice moment in One Piece that could plausibly plug into this signal. Sea Kings at Fishman Island, Zunesha on Zoo, Sunny in Wano, the drums of liberation, Roger on the Oro Jackson, Odin on the deck hearing the same thing. If we're going to say this is one system, then we actually have to test that across the whole story. So let me put the thesis on the table in plain language. Luffy is not hearing ghosts, is perceiving a structured, repeatable signal that connects wills, ancient technology, and the world itself. That signal has rules. It has range, it has bandwidth, it has user permissions. And Oda has been foreshadowing that system from absurdly early on, long before he had any reason to think the community would still be here arguing about it on week 1330 of serialization. To prove that, we need method. First, we're going to build a conceptual framework, because right now half the problem is vocabulary. What counts as foreshadowing versus retrofitting when we talk about the voice of all things? When Oda has Roger hear Sea Kings in an Odin flashback that comes out after Fishman Island, is that proof of pre-writing or a very elegant patch job? This is not a sin either way, but we have to put scenes into the right category or the whole argument turns to mush. Then we'll define the core terms this entire video is hanging on. When I say signal, I do not just mean VIBs. I mean a transmissible pattern that can be sent, received, blocked, amplified, and weaponized. When the story says voice, what is that in world? Is it sound? Is it haki? Is it a property of the planet? And when characters talk about will, are we dealing with emotion, destiny, or something closer to user identity on a network? If we don't lock those down, every example becomes meaningless noise, and we can't distinguish intentional design from happy accident. Because once you start noticing that Momonosuke doesn't just hear Zunisha, he can issue commands, or that the poneglyphs are literally fossilized while waiting for someone tuned to the right frequency, the stakes change. This stops being, or Luffy hears whales, and turns into, oh, the final war is about who controls the world's broadcast. By the end of this video, I'm going to argue that Gear 5 isn't just a goofy cartoon form. It's Luffy's body finishing its transformation into an antenna for an 800-year-old signal the world government has been trying to jam. So stay with me. We need to build the tools first, and then we're going to run them through the story, arc by arc, until that supposed mystery sense starts behaving like a very intentional piece of world building. So before we start screaming ancient Wi-Fi every time Luffy tilts his head and hears a whale, we need to talk about a dirty word in this community: foreshadowing. Because right now, the way fandom uses that word is completely cooked. Every single week, 2 panels rhyme visually: foreshadowing. A character stands in front of a sun once and then 10 years later there's a different sun in a different panel. Peak foreshadowing. Someone on Twitter posts a side-by-side, adds 4 clown emojis and a Oda been cooking since 97, and suddenly it's accepted canon that this was always meticulously, intentionally planned. I need you to understand how unserious that standard is. When every parallel, every coincidence, every thematic echo gets thrown into the same bucket, the term stops meaning anything. If foreshadowing just means 2 moments that kind of vibe together, then yes, sure, Luffy hearing the Sea Kings and Luffy hearing the drums of liberation are foreshadowing of each other. And also my breakfast cereal was foreshadowing the Void Sentry because it came in rings. But what we're about to do with Luffy's signal ability, that mushy definition is a problem. I'm not trying to argue, wow, cool coincidence Oda cooked. I'm trying to argue that for decades, an author with a pre-written endgame has been quietly building a specific, consistent system of communication under the pirate adventure. If I'm going to claim the Sea Kings at Fishman Island, Zunesha on Zoo, the Thousand Sunny in Wano, and the voice of the drums are all pieces of one planned mechanism, we need a strict standard. Oh, quick metaphor. You've heard the classic, Chekhov's gun. If there's a gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1, it needs to go off by Act 3. But that's not the full rule. Real foreshadowing is when the gun is there, because the author already knows who pulls the trigger, when, and why. The presence of the object is anchored to a decision that exists in the author's head before you ever read page 1. Now compare that to what our community usually does. We see a broom on the wall in Act 1, and in Act 3 someone stabs a guy with a fork, and suddenly it's Oda foreshadowed the fork with the broom, weapon parallels, peak writing. No, that's us being pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast. And this is not a sin. This is not bad fandom. This is normal. It's fun. It's how we entertain ourselves between chapters. But if we're going to separate Luffy hears ghosts LOL from Oda has been engineering a world-scale signal network since Roger heard the Sea Kings, we can't keep throwing Toast Jesus and Chekhov's gun into the same category, which means we need categories, plural. In the next section, I'm going to get annoyingly precise and split this stuff into 3 buckets: real foreshadowing, retrofitting, and a third weirder mode of writing Oda uses so often that we need a new label for it. Once we have those tools, then we can go back and ask very calmly what exactly Luffy is tuning into every time the world starts talking. Oh, versus. So, we need to get painfully clear on what goes in which bucket, because right now the community is just dumping everything into foreshadowing and calling it a day. That's the problem. When everything is foreshadowing, nothing is. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing in the classical sense is brutally narrow. It only counts if the author intentionally plants a detail early with a specific future payoff already in mind. Not a vague vibe, not a general direction, a concrete planned endpoint. You hang the gun on the mantelpiece in Act 1 because you already know who pulls the trigger in Act 3, why they do it and what it means. The setup isn't, maybe I'll use this later. The setup is a promise. Breakable, sure, but still a promise. Now, contrast that with retrofitting. Retrofitting is when an author takes something they wrote earlier, something that was loose or undefined, and later assigns it a sharper meaning that wasn't fully locked in at the start. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long-running storytelling survives past year 3. You throw in a mysterious scar, a weird reaction, a half-explained power, and 10 volumes later you go, oh, that's because he was secretly X the whole time, and you stitch it together. Done well, it feels seamless. Done poorly, it feels pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. But Oda keeps doing a third thing, and I need you to hold this one in your head. There isn't a clean academic term for it, so I'm calling it pre-writing. Pre-writing is when an author builds a dense web of motifs, symbols, and hooks, knowing they will pay them off somehow, but not always knowing the exact shape of every payoff in advance. The ending, the core mysteries, the major twists, those are pre-written. But the exact route, the exact panel where Luffy hears a ship cry, that can be discovered on the way. So instead of a single gun on the mantelpiece, pre-writing is Oda filling the entire room with weapons, blueprints, and half-assembled machines. He knows there will be a war. He knows which side wins. He just hasn't decided yet whether that particular wrench is going to smash a window or jam a gear. This is fine. This is normal for someone juggling 1,000 chapters. In One Piece, all three categories are firing constantly. Some things are obviously planned. Roger and Luffy both hearing the Sea Kings. Oden and Momonosuke sharing that same impossible voice. The drums of liberation tying back into sun motifs from forever ago. Every single week, some things are clearly retrofits. Skypia's mantra getting formalized later as Haki, or gagged dragons turning into Wano trauma. And then there are the weird half-planned nodes, the voice of all things, the living ships, the way the world itself keeps speaking through random objects, all sitting there as flexible anchor points Oda keeps wiring new meaning into. So here's how we're going to use this. For every single moment where Luffy hears something, Sea Kings, Zunesha, the Thousand Sunny, the drums, we're going to stop and ask, is this a gun on the mantelpiece, a clever retrofit, or a pre-written node in a network Oda was still discovering himself? And once we sort those out, then we can finally talk about what signal he's actually picking up. Because listen to me, if we put these scenes in the wrong bucket, we will completely misunderstand what Oda has been building for 25 years. So before we start accusing Oda of being a time-traveling octopus with 16 notebooks and a pact with the Sea Devil, we need to slow down and nail one boring, crucial thing. What foreshadowing actually is. Not vibes, not coincidences, foreshadowing. Because listen to me, if we mess this up, every cool parallel just gets thrown in the same bucket and the word stops meaning anything. Foreshadowing, in the classical sense, is when an author intentionally plants information early in a story that will pay off later. The key word there is intentionally. The question is not, does this connect? The question is always, did the author already know the payoff when they wrote this setup? If the answer is no, it might still be great storytelling, it might still feel incredibly satisfying, but it belongs in a different category. So here's the thing. Imagine a simple 3-act story. In Act 1, we see a locked door at the end of the hallway. The camera lingers, the character glances at it, nervous every time they pass. No one explains it. In Act 3, the climax reveals there's a prisoner behind that door whose testimony blows open the whole plot. That only counts as foreshadowing if, when the author wrote Act 1, they already knew there was a prisoner, already knew the role that prisoner would play in the climax. If, instead, they just wrote mysterious door because mystery is fun, and 3 years later went, oh, that could be a prisoner sick, that's not foreshadowing, that's retrofitting. This is not a sin, this is fine, this is normal. Most serialized authors are doing this constantly because humans are not omniscient outline machines and deadlines are real. Now translate that to One Piece. Shanks losing his arm in Chapter 1 and explicitly saying he's betting it on the new era is the locked door. Luffy declaring he'll become a great pirate, inheriting that hat, that will, that risk is the prisoner behind it. You feel that intent is locked from page 1. Oda knows this kid is going to shake the world and he burns a Yonko tier limb to underline it. That's planned. That's foreshadowing. Contrast that with something vaguer. Suppose there's a random storm in Chapter 3. No special framing, no weird reactions, just bad weather. 15 years later, the author says, ah yes, that was secretly the world reacting to Luffy's birth as Joy Boy 2.0. Cool idea, on headcanon. But unless that exact concept was already in the plan, that's a retrofit. Our pattern-seeking monkey brain sees Jesus in toast and wants to call it destiny. The definition says no. And this is where the Sea Kings start swimming into frame, because when we get to Fishman Island and those Sea Kings react to Shirahoshi, and we remember the Roger flashback where they react the same way, we have to ask, is that door and prisoner foreshadowing from decades earlier, or a gun Oda quietly slipped onto the mantelpiece later and pretended it had always been there? I need you to keep that test in your pocket, because next, when Luffy starts hearing things, the Sea Kings, Zunesha, the Sunny, the drums, we're going to use it on every single voice. So before we start stress testing every sea king and elephant in the series, we need to talk about something that makes the community weirdly defensive. Retrofitting. Because if you treat every cool coincidence as 4D foreshadowing, you're going to misread what Oda is actually doing with Luffy's weird hearing. Here's the thing. Retrofitting is not a slur. Retrofitting is when an author looks back at something they already put on the page and goes, oh, I can use that, and then builds a new meaning or twist around it that wasn't fully decided when it first appeared. The panel didn't originally carry that specific intention. The panel becomes intentional later, when the author folds it into a new plan. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how most serialized storytelling survives past Volume 3 without collapsing into sludge. Especially in manga. These people are drawing 20 pages a week under Industrial Revolution in a sweatshop conditions. You cannot pre-plan every background extra and every offhand line, so you leave yourself floaty pieces, a marine with a distinctive scar, a weirdly detailed ship, a throwaway cover story. Then, years later, you reach back and promote them. I need you to understand the difference here. Foreshadowing is when the author already knows the payoff and plants the seed early. Retrofitting is when the author plants a seed without a specific flower in mind, then later decides, actually, that's going to be a carnivorous plot twist now, and waters it accordingly. The reader experience can be almost identical. The production process is not. Let me give you a clean example. Imagine an early, random Marine officer who shows up in one East Blue chapter, gets punched by Luffy, and vanishes. Nothing in the moment screams secret boss. Years later, the story needs a CP0 agent embedded in the Marines. The author flips back through old volumes, finds Scar Marine guy, and goes perfect. Suddenly, that nobody is reintroduced as a terrifying masked assassin who's been undercover the whole time. Was that planned from day one? Probably not. But if the new role matches his old behavior, if the reappearance is cleverly justified, the retrofit feels organic when you reread. This is fine. This is normal. Pattern interrupt. The universe does not hand authors perfectly foreshadowed panels. There is no cosmic storyboard Katak. There is just a tired human with deadlines, a stack of drafts, and a pattern-seeking monkey brain very similar to yours and mine. So when we get to the voice of all things, we need to keep this category in play. Some of Luffy's early mysterious hearing ability moments may have started as a vibe, not a fully engineered system. Maybe the first time Oda had a Sea King talk, he just wanted an eerie mythic beat. Then Roger in Oden's flashback hears the same thing. Then Zunesha and the Sunny. At some point, that loose idea hardens into a rule set, a signal, a frequency, a network. If that evolution involved retrofitting, that does not weaken Oda's craft. The only real test is the reread test. When you go back, does the pattern hold or does it creak? And with Luffy's voices, I'm going to argue it holds so well that it stops feeling mystical and starts looking engineered. Which means next, we need to follow that signal from Fishman Island to Wano and see what exactly he's tuning into. So if the pattern holds, if this voice thing reads as engineered and not random, we need a better tool than just screaming foreshadowing at every panel and calling it a day. And this is where I'm going to cheat. I'm going to invent a category that doesn't really have a clean, formal name in the writing textbooks. I'm calling it pre-writing. But listen to me, I don't mean the high school worksheet where your English teacher makes you draw a mind map. For Oda, pre-writing is front-loading the story with symbols, motifs and half-explained systems he knows are pillars, without necessarily having every screw and bolt of the machine specced out. The will of D, the void century, the voice of all things. Those aren't random mysteries. Those are label boxes on his wall of notes that say, do not touch, this matters. Here's the thing. In practice, that looks messy. It looks chaotic. Oda will drop the will of D in chapter what? 0-ish, then vanish it for volumes. He'll show you the void century as a negative space in Robin's backstory, then refuse to explain it for 20 years. He'll have Roger and Oden hearing voices on the Oro Jackson and never tell you what frequency they're tuned to. The details of how these systems interlock? Those get refined on the fly as the story evolves, as he figures out how to stage the final war, who needs to know what when, all of that. That's the difference between pre-writing and pure retrofitting. With pre-writing, the author knows this thing is load-bearing. The gun is on the mantle because the shooting scene is already in the outline, even if the exact choreography isn't storyboarded. With retrofitting, you're rummaging through old chapters going, oh, that background extra had a hat, what if he's secretly the king of space? And then you reverse engineer meaning onto it. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal. Most long series survive on a mix of both. But Luffy's voices, those do not feel opportunistic to me. From early on, Oda commits to Luffy having a special sensory channel. Fishman Island, he hears the Sea Kings, mirrors Roger's exact reaction, and the story explicitly flags that as the same phenomenon. Zu, he and Momonosuke both hear Zunesha, but only Momo can transmit a command, which quietly tells you this is a two-way system, not just spooky intuition. Wano, he hears the Thousand Sunnies screaming as it's about to be destroyed. Then Gear 5 hits, and the drums of liberation turn his entire body into a broadcast tower. That's not a random ghost hotline. That's a signal network slowly coming into focus. Oh, here's what we're going to do. I need you to mentally pin Luffy's I heard a voice moments on a timeline. In the next section, we'll track how the portrayal of the voice of all things shifts from vague, he's got good instincts, to an explicit communication system that connects Sea Kings, Zunesha, poneglyphs, maybe even the world itself. And we'll try to separate what was a pre-written pillar from what was a later refinement Oda bolted onto the chassis once he realized his main character is basically a walking antenna. And here's where we need to slam the brakes for a second and talk about reality. Because it's very easy, sitting on your couch, pausing panel spreads on an iPad, to imagine Oda in a candlelit room with a conspiracy wall that runs 800 chapters into the future. But listen to me. Weekly manga is a meat grinder, not a chess tournament. A standard jump schedule is roughly 15 to 20 pages a week, every week, for decades. That means storyboard drafts, penciling, inking, backgrounds, assistants, corrections, plus editor meetings where some poor guy in a suit is asking you to make the cool clown more marketable. On top of that, if your series is successful, you're suddenly reviewing anime storyboards, doing movie tie-in designs, approving merch, drawing color spreads, answering SBS questions about whether Frankie's Cola is canonically diet. Now imagine, in the middle of all that, maintaining a flawless 4D, no contradictions ever mystery web about ancient civilizations, bloodlines, geopolitical conspiracies, and a rubber demigod's radio frequency. No missed beats, no changed plans, no, that detail was vague, let me nudge it later. Do you understand the level of psychological collapse we're talking about? That's not foreshadowing anymore, that's a cry for help. And then you stack on the external pressure. Reader surveys every week, rankings that can get you axed in a volume or two if you dip. Editors pushing for popularity spikes, telling you to introduce a cool swordsman, or speed up the arc, or maybe hold off on that depressing flashback because the anime needs a hype moment. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how commercial storytelling in a magazine works. So when fans in the community insist that every line from Chapter 12 was a perfectly intentional breadcrumb for some Gear 5 lore reveal 20 years later, I need you to breathe. Some of it absolutely was planned, some of it was pre-written, and some of it was Oda looking back, seeing an old weird detail and going, oh, that's useful. I can attach new meaning to that. Retrofitting, not a dirty word, a survival tool. Here's the thing. Because of this brutal ecosystem, even a monster planner has to leave space, and you keep the pillars fixed. The ending, the void century, the will of D, what the One Piece actually is. But you let the connective tissue stay elastic. You sketch Luffy hears the world as a core idea, but the exact form that takes with Sea King, Zunisha, ships and drums, that can flex depending on pacing, reception, and which assistant hasn't quit yet. That's where this signal system becomes impressive. Not because every panel was carved in stone from day one, but because, while surfing deadlines, surveys and studio emails, Oda managed to keep this one through line coherent. Luffy's antenna sense survives every editorial earthquake, and in the next section, we're going to map that trail chapter by chapter, and see where the blueprint ends and the retrofitting begins. And to really see where that blueprint ends, we need to zoom out from Oda for a second and talk about how these monsters actually get made in the first place. Because in the community, there is this persistent fanfic of an author, the omniscient mastermind in a swivel chair with a 20-volume Bible where every joke, every power system rule, every dead side character's blood type was perfectly planned on day one. And listen to me, that version of Oda, that version of any long-running author, does not exist. Here's the thing, real serialization is trench warfare. You have an editor breathing down your neck, reader surveys threatening your cancellation, assistants getting sick, and you still have to cough up 19 pages by Thursday. What you actually do is sketch a broad destination, a handful of major reveals, some emotional tentacles, the ending, the core mysteries, the big character turns. Then you discover the exact roads while you're already driving 120. So the process becomes this constant loop. Draft, publish, watch what the fans latch onto, then retrofitting and pre-writing around the pieces that clearly work. A gag you tossed in as flavor suddenly resonates. Cool, that's now a thematic motif. A side character polls well? Congratulations, they're secretly crucial royalty. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long runners survive long enough to become classics in the first place. You can see the seams all over Naruto. Chakra starts as this fairly grounded stamina system, then suddenly we're in alien chakra gods and eyeball Wi-Fi territory. The Sharingan's abilities keep getting patched in mid-arc because Kishimoto needs new escalation levers. Toby's identity wobbles around behind the mask. Interviews basically admit that plan changed. The story still works, but the power system clearly isn't a single pristine pre-forged machine. Bleach is another great example. Early on you have simple Soul Reaper swords and some spiritual pressure. By the time we hit the Arrancar and Quincy Wars, Kubo is stapling on resurrection forms, shrift letters, Vollständig, whole categories of lore that retroactively explain things he drew years earlier. Fans will write dissertations insisting it was all intentional foreshadowing. No, a lot of it is clever retrofitting, finding patterns in earlier noise and deciding what they meant after the fact. And this is normal. So where does that leave Oda? I need you to hold two thoughts at once. 1. He is absolutely an outlier. The man keeps track of gags, minor characters and geopolitical rules at a level that makes other authors look a little drunk. 2. He is still human. He is still reacting to popularity polls, his own changing interests, and the raw physics of weekly production. That's why we have to separate pre-written spine from discovered muscle. Oda can have the Void Century, Laugh Tale, Luffy's Endgame, and the core of the voice of all things planned, while still improvising specific islands, side villains, and even some categories of hacky as he goes. The consistency is real, but the myth of total omniscience turns every retrofit into fake foreshadowing and every course correction into heresy. Before we drag Oda to the stand on Luffy's antenna powers, we need an external case study, a long runner where we can actually watch the author retrofit in real time, see the weld marks and prove to ourselves that this hybrid process is how the sausage gets made. Because once you see that other series literally change the signal halfway through, Luffy's voices start to look very different. So in the next section we're going to step outside One Piece entirely and dissect a non-Oda retrofit that's so blatant it might permanently change how you read those genius twists. So, let's talk about the poster child for genius foreshadowing discourse. Toby from Naruto. You remember this, goofy masked idiot doing bad Madara cosplay, talking in baby talk and tripping over his own feet, and then boom, he rips the mask off and he's Obito Kakashi's dead childhood friend. The community lost its mind. Forums melted. AMVs multiplied like rabbits. Immediately, the retroactive detective work started. People dug up every panel. Look, the hair silhouette matches Obito's. Look, he only ever shows his right eye. Look, he says weird stuff about that time with Kakashi. Suddenly there were 4-0 PowerPoints proving Kishimoto had planned this from chapter 1, that every comedy bit was secretly a tragic mask, that we were witnessing 4D chess foreshadowing. Here's the thing, a bunch of those hints are just vague enough that you can staple them to any answer you want. One eye? Cool, That's also Madara's whole deal. Vague comments about the past? That's every brooding Naruto villain. Even the hair is doing a lot of work there. We need to admit we're pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and then write essays about the bread's narrative symbolism. Except listen to me, Kishimoto's literally told us this wasn't some perfectly locked-in master plan. In interviews, he said he didn't have every detail nailed down early, that certain character backstories and identities shifted during serialization. At one point, Toby was going to just be Madara. At another, the Obito idea emerged later and he worked backwards. That means at least some of those early hints weren't intentional Obito breadcrumbs. They were retrofitted, meaning assigned after the fact. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal. Retrofitting is a completely valid tool. The author looks at old material, sees an opening and goes, oh, I can hook this into my new plan. So the single eye suddenly becomes a tragic Obito parallel. The goofy persona becomes a mask to hide his pain. On reread, it feels seamless, so fans reclassify it as foreshadowing instead of what it actually is, smart patchwork. So how do we categorize Toby, Obito? Broad strokes? Sure, maybe Kishimoto always wanted a Kakashi-related twist, some dead friend in the shadows, but the specific identity, the timing, the exact flavor of angst, those clearly evolved. The genius foreshadowing here is, in large part, retrofitting. That just happens to go down smooth when you binge the story instead of living through the weekly whiplash. And I need you to clock what your brain did there, because we do the exact same thing with Oda. Every time 2 panels rhyme across 500 chapters, the community screams foreshadowing and builds a conspiracy board. This is fine when we're praising craft. It's a problem when we start treating every coincidence, every reused pose, every offhand line about voices as proof that Luffy's ghost radio was planned in microscopic detail from page 1. Pattern interrupt. What if some of those signals aren't proof of god-tier pre-planning at all, but very elegant retrofits? In the next section, we're going back to One Piece and putting Luffy's so-called ghost voices under that exact microscope. So before we start stamping retrofit on panels and making tier lists of which Sea King Whisper was or wasn't planned, I need you to separate 2 things in your head: emotional payoff and technical category. Did it hit you in the gut? That's one question. Was it intentional foreshadowing or an elegant patch job? Completely different question. Your feelings are not on trial here. Your pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast every time a character hears a mysterious voice, may be on trial, but not your feelings. Here's the thing. In the Naruto example, when Toby pulls off the mask and it's Obito, a lot of fans had a real, visceral reaction. Shock, betrayal, oh my god, Kakashi, the whole package. That reaction is real. That reaction is valid. Even if behind the scenes Kishimoto had bounced between Toby as Obito, Toby as Azuna, Toby as a Madara puppet, and finally circle back around, that does not retroactively delete your experience. The twist can be partially retrofitted and still emotionally land. Retrofitting is a technical category, not a moral judgment. When we say this part of Toby's reveal was retrofitted, we are not secretly saying you were dumb for being hyped, or this was bad writing. We're saying the author looked at an earlier, flexible piece of the story and decided later on to assign it a sharper meaning. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is in fact how most long serialization works when the author is not a time-traveling spreadsheet demon. Now drag that lens back to One Piece and Luffy's so-called ghost radio. When Luffy hears the Sea Kings at Fishman Island, when he and Momonosuke hear Zunesha on Zou, when he reacts to the Thousand Sunny's voice in Wano, when the drums of liberation start pounding and suddenly the whole world seems to vibrate on his wavelength, those moments hit. They feel mythic. They feel earned. You do not lose that just because we might tag some of them as retrofits instead of day one foreshadowing. If we end up saying, okay, this early voice panel was probably just spooky flavor text that Oda later folded into the voice of all things system, that isn't an accusation. That is a compliment. It means the author is so good at integrating his own evolving ideas that the retrofit reads as intentional from the start. That's craft. That's high-level storytelling, not fraud. And this matters for the argument I'm building, because right now the community treats retrofit and fake as synonyms. If retrofit equals scam in your head, you will bend over backwards to call everything foreshadowing just to protect how it made you feel. We need to stop doing that. We need to be able to say this was planned, this was patched, both were awesome, or we will never honestly map which parts of the voice of all things were actually on the whiteboard before Chapter 1. Because with Luffy's ability, the interesting question is not, did Oda plan this from the very first panel? The interesting question is, at what point did he decide this wasn't just a spooky protagonist quirk, but an actual system, a signal that ties into the ancient network under the whole world? That's where we're going next. So if we're going to treat this as a system and not just Oda's spooky protagonist filter, we need to actually define the thing. What even is the voice of all things in universe? Not the Tumblr headcanon version. The text. Here's the thing. The story is pretty blunt when it bothers to talk about it. Rayleigh tells Luffy that Roger could hear the voices of all things in the world. Oden's journal describes the same phenomenon when he sails with Roger. The Sea Kings at Fishman Island literally comment that another one has appeared who can hear them, echoing their memories of Roger. Over and over, the phrasing is consistent, hearing voices that are already there, woven into the world. And it's not a Luffy-only perk. Roger has it, Oden has it, Luffy has it, Momonosuke has it, and in Zoo we see the crucial twist. Both Luffy and Momo can hear Zunesha, but only Momo can issue a command. Reception versus transmission. There are probably others in the margins, characters who brush against it without getting a title card, but the pattern is clear. It's rare, but it is not unique. It clusters around people with absurd willpower who sit in these destiny-adjacent roles in the story's architecture. Now, immediately, the community's instinct is to shove this into the Haki bucket and call it a day. Observation Haki lets you sense presence, intent, emotions. So fans go, oh, advance Ko, and move on. This is not a sin. This is normal. But it does flatten an intentional distinction the author keeps drawing. HIK is you projecting and sharpening your will. The voice of all things is you tuning into something external that's already broadcasting. One is a flashlight. The other is a radio. Watch what it actually does on the page. Every time it triggers, the recipient is getting information from something that should not be talking in a normal sense. Sea Kings at Fishman Island narrating prophecy. Zunesha on Zoo recounting its crime and begging for orders. The poneglyphs, which are literally described as indestructible records of voices from the past, being read by Roger not through language study, but through this sense. Even the Thousand Sunny and Wano, where Luffy reacts to the ship's feelings as if they're a voice he can pick up. Oh no, Luffy is not hearing ghosts, he's not role-playing an exorcist, he is, functionally, an interface with a hidden communication layer baked into the setting. Listen to me. The series keeps hinting that the world itself is wired, that wills, records, and certain beings are all pinging on the same channel, and a tiny handful of people are born with the tuner to access it. And if that's true, then the voice of all things stops being a fun flavor power and becomes something much scarier. Proof that an ancient, global signal is still running under the world government's feet. The question is not, what can Luffy hear anymore? The question is, what exactly is broadcasting? Who set it up? And what happens when someone finally turns the volume all the way up? That's where we go next, and I need you to brace yourself, because once we walk through the scenes one by one, you're not going to be able to unhear this system ever again. And here's where one word quietly flips the entire table. The moment you stop calling it voices and start calling it a signal, your brain is forced to do different math. Signals have senders. Signals have receivers. Signals have a medium, a range, interference, amplification. You stop asking, ooh, what spooky ghost is whispering to Luffy? And you start asking, who built this? What's powering it? And why are only certain idiots made of rubber able to tune in? Ghosts are a conversation ender. The Sea Kings talk to Roger. Wow, mysterious. Full stop. You file it under magic, you pat yourself on the head, you move on. A signal is a conversation starter. If it's a signal, then there are rules. There's consistency. There's infrastructure. And if there's infrastructure, then someone at some point intentionally wired the world this way. Listen to me. The word you use is not cosmetic, it's a category choice. Call it ghosts, and you've put it in the vibes and destiny bucket. Call it a signal, and suddenly it belongs to the systems and technology bucket. Same scenes, completely different story. But here's the thing. Once you say signal, you can start talking about wavelength, not metaphorical poetry wavelength. A literal band of reality that responds to will. What Luffy, Roger, Odin, Momonosuke, even the Sea Kings are tapping into is a shared frequency generated by three things at once. Concentrated individual will, remnants of ancient technology, and the planet itself as a gigantic, slightly abused antenna. At Fishman Island, Luffy hears the Sea Kings, echoing Roger's exact reaction in Oden's flashback. On Zoo, he and Momo both receive Zunasha's voice, but only Momo can send a command back. That's not ghost talk, that's a duplex line. In Wano, Luffy hears the Thousand Sunny crying out during the fire, which is absurd unless the ship's accumulated will turns it into a node. When the drums of liberation start pounding, everyone with a shred of sensitivity reacts as if someone just cranked the broadcast to 11. Pattern interrupt. What if the drums aren't a soundtrack? What if they're the ringtone of the planet when the network goes fully online? I need you to notice how often Oda ties this to foreshadowing of ancient infrastructure. Poneglyphs are voices of the past, but physically carved. Ancient weapons are city killers, sure, but they're also perfectly named to be transmitters or receivers. Laugh Tale is literally the place where hearing the world properly makes you burst out laughing. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is an author quietly committing to one planned communication system for 25 years and trusting fans to eventually stop seeing Jesus in toast and start seeing a router. So here's what we're going to do next. We need to stop treating each Luffy heard something weird moment as an isolated miracle and start treating them as data points. I'm going to walk you through every single instance in order, and we're going to map range, clarity, emotional load, and consequences as if we're reverse engineering an invisible global network Oda has been stress testing in plain sight. By the end of that, the question won't be, can Luffy hear the voice of all things anymore? It'll be, what happens when the world hears him back? So let's start stress testing that invisible network at the most chaotic possible moment. Marine Ford. I need you to remember the panel, everyone emotionally clocked and then intellectually ignored. Luffy is sprinting through a meat grinder of admirals and warlords, and then he just drops, clutching his head, eyes blown out, while the narration tells you the voices of people on the battlefield are disappearing one by one. Not screams, not cries. Voices, fading, singular units ticking down. And he's not reacting to any one death in particular. The story is very clear that this is a mass event. His system overloads and he faceplants in the middle of the war of the best. That is not normal hacky behavior. That is not, oh no, my brother might die dramatization. That is a different category of signal. Here's the thing. The community almost never talks about this scene in mechanical terms. We talk about Ace's death. We talk about Whitebeard's last stand. We talk about Shanks walking in and hitting the giant red stop anime button. The weird sensory collapse in the middle, that gets filed under emotional shorthand. The author needed a way to show the horror of war, so Luffy becomes a proxy for your feelings. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. If you're dealing with a series that isn't obsessed with codifying every power system down to the emotional tax bracket, but we're not in a normal series. We're in a story where hearing voices is a repeated intentional term attached to a very small group of people. So instead of treating Marineford Luffy as a metaphor sponge, treat him as a broken antenna. The data on the page is that he is passively receiving the wills of hundreds of people as they wink out, at range, through solid chaos with no conscious activation. That's not him using observation haki on nearby enemies. That's a broadcast slamming into his skull. Now, does that mean Oda had already drawn the Sea Kings and Zunesha panels in a secret notebook and was just slow dripping them? Probably not at that exact resolution. This is where I'd put Marineford in the pre-writing column. The decision that Luffy has a unique sensory channel to the world's will is already made every single week. The exact diagram for how that overlaps with the voice of all things, Sea Kings, elephant Wi-Fi, and future drums of liberation Bluetooth? Still fuzzy, you can feel Oda testing the upper limit of what he can get away with without slapping a label on it. And listen to me, once you've seen him explicitly hear Sea Kings at Fishman Island and Zunisha on Zoo, this moment stops reading as artsy war poetry. It reads as the first time that global signal almost fries his brain and turned on in the worst possible place, with no filter, and nearly cooked the hardware. Because the next time it turns on, he's not just receiving, he's sharing the channel. Because the next time it turns on, he's not just receiving, he's sharing the channel. And if Luffy is the moment the network starts talking back, then we need to ask a very boring, very unsexy question. Who installed the router in the first place? That's where Roger and Oden stop being nostalgia bait and start being user manuals. Oden's flashbacks are not just, oh wow, young Rayleigh Pog. They're a technical walkthrough of an earlier generation of receivers. You watch Roger on the Oro Jackson sailing into Sea King territory during the period around Shirahoshi's birth, and Oda does this very intentional thing. He has Roger stop, tilt his head, and react to something nobody else can hear. He calls it the voices of all things. He grins. Oden is confused. The community memes it as, haha, Pirate Jesus hears fish. Except here's the thing. We've already seen that exact scene, just later in the publication order. Go back to Fishman Island. Luffy, unconscious and half dead, suddenly hears the Sea Kings raging around Noah. Same wide-eyed jolt, same invisible conversation, same framing where everyone else is just staring at a kid who is apparently talking to the ocean. Oda even mirrors the panel composition. Close up on the ear, then the stunned face, then the cut to monstrous eyes in the deep. That is not coincidence. That is not a vague thematic echo. That is, the author deliberately rhyming 2 points on the same signal. Roger is not just hearing random words, he's getting intent. He's pulling navigation data out of the air. He follows poneglyphs, yes, but he also rides this ambient broadcast straight to the final island. When he laughs at Laughtail, it isn't because the treasure is a good punchline. It's because the whole world's archived has just been played back in one absurd binge watch. The Sea Kings talking about the promised day, the prophecy around Poseidon, the void century context baked into the stones. He's reading the global RSS feed in real time. Now Oden. Oden is the important counterexample that stops this from turning into Roger was just born better cope. Oden hears something. He notes a strange voice from the Sea Kings. He senses Zenacia. He can read the poneglyphs themselves, but he can't pass the content the way Roger does. He's tuned to the frequency, but the signal is fuzzy. Think of him as the AM radio in a tunnel. You catch fragments, you know there's a song, but you can't sing the lyrics back. This is not a sin. This is normal in Oda's system. Different characters get different bandwidth. Which brings us back to Luffy. Once you stack these scenes, Roger at Sea Kings, Roger at Laughtail, Oden half-hearing, Luffy at Fishman Island, the pattern stops being, wow, Oda sure loves parallels, and becomes a design document. A signal has been active for at least 800 years. Ancient weapons, Sea Kings, Zunisha, the Poneglyph network, all broadcasting. Roger is the first guy we see who can read the feed. Oden is the guy who can hear the noise. Luffy is the one who, for the first time, can answer. And I need you to sit with that. Because if he can answer, then somebody on the other end has been waiting for a reply. If someone's been waiting for a reply, then we need to talk about where their original message is stored. And no, I don't mean stored in the Dragon Ball sense of a shiny orb on a pedestal. Go back to Oden's flashback. Roger's crew finally reaches the last island. They read the poneglyphs. They see the truth of the void century. And what do? They laugh. They don't scream at the pile of gold. They don't weep over a dead civilization. They burst out laughing at a story. Oden literally frames it as them discovering a tale so outrageous they can't help it. That's your first clue. The One Piece is information before it's treasure. Here's the thing. Those road poneglyphs weren't just a scavenger hunt for geography. They were routing tables. Each stone is a packet of data, pushed out across the world, redundantly copied, so even if the world government smashes one, the route still exists somewhere else. Laughtail isn't just the final island. It's the central node where all those packets finally assemble and decode into a coherent narrative of the Void Sentry's will. So I need you to stop imagining Laughtale as a cave full of gold and start imagining it as a server room. Not a sleek sci-fi lab, but an ancient half-organic archive built by people who understood Haki and the voice of all things as literal infrastructure. The poneglyphs are the distributed storage. Laughtale is the mainframe running the operating system that can read them all at once. Now plug Roger into that. The story tells you he can't read the script, he's illiterate in that sense, but he can hear the voices of the stones, of Sea Kings, of the world itself. That's not ghost talk, that's an interface. His voice of all things is the adapter cable that lets a human consciousness handshake with this network. Odin is the translator for the visual data. Roger is the receiver for the audio feed. Together, they're the first full-stack client to successfully log in to Laughtale's server in 800 years. Pattern interrupt. What if the Void Sentry people weren't wiped out because they built weapons, but because they built Wi-Fi? A global will-based communication layer that made top-down control impossible. You don't erase that just by banning books. You have to bury the routers under an ocean and outlaw anyone who can still hear the signal. And this is where Luffy stops being Roger 2.0 inches and becomes something scarier. Roger could connect and receive. On Zu, we see the next step. Momonosuke can hear Zunisha and issue a command, receive and transmit. By Wano, Luffy is hearing the drums of liberation, syncing his heartbeat to some primordial rhythm that makes the whole world react. That's not just reception anymore, that's broadcast behavior. If Laughtale is the server quietly holding the Void Sentry's will, then Luffy is the broadcast tower that will take that stored signal and push it across the entire planet at once. And listen to me, that reframes the endgame. This isn't a treasure hunt payoff, it's a software update for the world, which raises a much uglier question. If someone is about to flip the global broadcast back on, who's been jamming the signal for 800 years? So if someone's been jamming the signal for 800 years, the first question is, where was that signal stored? Because information doesn't just evaporate. It hides, it compresses, it gets written down. Enter the poneglyphs. These are not just lore rocks for trivia-obsessed fans. They're indestructible stone slabs, scattered across the world, that somehow survived the exact cataclysm that erased an entire century from official history. They hold straight historical records. They hold coordinates to super weapons. They hold a personal apology letter from Joy Boy. That is not random. That is a planned, curated archive. Here's the thing. In-universe, nobody treats them as neutral objects. Robin doesn't read a poneglyph the way you or I read a grocery list. She treats it as a conversation. When she finds the Rio poneglyph in Skipper, she doesn't say, "Ah yes, data." She talks about the people who carved it, the feelings behind the words. Odin in his flashback stands in front of these stones and reacts as though he's hearing the voices of an entire era coming out of the wall. That's the recorded will concept. The author is telling you that will can be preserved in more than one format. Odin and Robin. The poneglyphs are the past speaking in text instead of sound. It's still a voice, it's just been flattened into kanji and hammered into basalt so the world government can't burn it. Now connect that to the signal metaphor we've been building. If the voice of all things is the live broadcast of Will Luffy hearing Sea Kings at Fishman Island, Roger hearing the exact same conversation decades earlier, then the poneglyphs are the archived recordings. Same show, different medium. Live radio versus a vinyl record. The category of information is identical, only the encoding changes. And I need you to sit with how intentional that feels. Oda doesn't just have history text and mystical voice as two unrelated magic systems. He keeps staging them in parallel. Roger can't read the glyphs, but he can hear the world. Robin can't hear the world, but she can read the glyphs. Put them together on the Oro Jackson and suddenly Laughtale makes sense. That's not coincidence. That's a designed interface, which raises a nasty speculative question. What happens when someone who hears the signal stands directly in front of the hard drive? We haven't seen Luffy or Roger listen to a poneglyph on panel, but if Zunisha's thoughts can ride the same wavelength as the Sea Kings, why couldn't the will etched into stone resonate too? We need to at least consider the possibility that to someone tuned to that frequency, those carvings aren't silent at all, because once you frame it that way, the world starts to look suspiciously technical. Robin is the visual user interface. Luffy is the organic antenna. The poneglyphs are storage nodes. And then you remember there are also colossal constructs and creatures, ancient weapons, Zunesha itself, that respond to this same category of will. So what do you get when you plug a living receiver into a network of indestructible hard drives and then bolt that onto a planet-sized superweapon? You don't just get a war, you get a full communication stack. And the terrifying part is who might already be running their own version of it, which brings us to the first time the network actually screams loud enough that the story can't play it off as vibes anymore. Fishman Island. We need to sit with that Noah scene. The arc is free-falling, everyone's panicking, Shirahoshi's already a mess, and then, mid-crisis, Luffy just hard freezes. He clutches his head, looks into empty water and goes, "Those voices, they're so loud. Nobody else hears anything. Not Jinbe, not the princes, not even Shirahoshi. And if you've read Oden's flashback, your brain should be doing the Windows error sound right there, because Roger does the exact same thing when the Sea Kings start talking about her. Here's the thing. Oda doesn't keep that conversation vague. The Sea Kings are having a very specific, very plot-relevant chat. They talk about that day finally coming. They mention that the time is near, that the promised one of the Sea Kings has been born, that Poseidon will meet another sovereign in the not-too-distant future. They literally clock Shirahoshi as Poseidon, recognize Luffy as the other king, and frame it all as the payoff to a prophecy that's been buffering for centuries. And Luffy is not just sensing danger. He's clearly picking up intent. He reacts right when they decide to catch Noah. He relaxes when their mood shifts from "we must destroy" to "we can protect." This isn't the fuzzy emotional radar of standard observation haki, where you go, "Ah yes, killing intent over there." This is tuned reception of an actual conversation, with timing and content that matter. Fans love to handwave this as advanced observation, because our brains are pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and haki in everything. But the author already gave you the control group. Roger has the same reaction to the same species in a parallel scene, and it's explicitly labelled the voice of all things. The specificity of the Sea King's dialogue, plus the one-to-one visual echo between Roger and Luffy, throws this out of the maybe intuition category and straight into, no, this was planned as a shared ability. I need you to notice the craft move here. This isn't a random Echo Oda retrofits later. By Fishman Island, he already knows he wants Luffy to inherit Roger's receiver role. So he builds a clean setup/payoff pair. First we see Roger hearing the Sea Kings about Shirahoshi's future. Then we see Luffy hearing them at the exact moment that future starts to activate. That's not coincidence. That's pre-written endgame peeking through the cracks. Now zoom out and apply the signal thesis. These Sea Kings aren't just big talking fish. They're enormous, semi-sapient antennas parked around an ancient weapon, reacting to a broadcast that started in the Void Century and is key to Poseidon and Joy Boy's promised reunion. They feel the prophecy coming online, they route the packet to Luffy and Shirahoshi, and our rubber idiot's skull just happens to be the perfect receiver to pick it up. And if this is how loud the signal gets at the bottom of the sea, what happens when we move to an island that's literally riding on top of the transmitter? Because that's what Fishman Island is. It's not just a setting, it's a scheduled broadcast station that happens to be underwater and covered in candy architecture. So, quick reset, Poseidon is not a metaphor. In this story, Poseidon is Shirahoshi, a very anxious goldfish princess who can command Sea Kings, and that role was predicted centuries in advance by the Sea Kings themselves. They literally talk about the day she will be born, while dragging Noah through the ocean. The community reaction was, wow, cool prophecy, but listen to me, that's the wrong category. Here's the thing, prophecy in most fantasy is a vague poem some wizard cooked up on a weekend bender. In One Piece, the prophecy of Poseidon is coming from the Sea Kings, who are effectively the hardware. They've seen this cycle before. They know that on a fixed interval, a certain pattern in the world system turns on. Joy Boy, Poseidon, Noah, Fishman Island. So when they speak about the future, they're not fortune-telling, they're recalling a maintenance schedule. This is the difference that matters for foreshadowing. If an author writes a prophecy after the fact to justify a twist, that's retrofitting. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. But what Oda is doing with Shirahoshi is pre-writing on a cosmic calendar. The Sea Kings have internalized an 800-year signal loop, and the prediction is them recognizing, oh, the broadcast is due to air again. Now plug the voice of all things into that. When Shirahoshi awakens as Poseidon, Luffy and the Sea Kings suddenly share a channel, Roger, decades earlier, heard those same voices in Odin's flashback. Different era, same event in the cycle. That's not random magic. That is a scheduled broadcast that certain receivers, people with this weird voice sense, can pick up when the world's antenna flares. I need you to notice how specific that is. Luffy doesn't hear every fish. He doesn't walk into an aquarium and get assaulted by clownfish discourse. He hears Sea Kings at a critical Poseidon moment. He hears Zunisha when its marching order comes due. He hears the drums of liberation when his own fruit boots into its final form. Each time a system event triggers and our rubber antenna registers the ping. So where does that system come from? The obvious suspect is the Void Century civilization. If they could build 3 planet-scale weapons, it is not a stretch to say they also built biological or technological mechanisms that ensure certain signals recur at fixed intervals. Joy Boy's promised return, the rebirth of Poseidon, Zunesha's sentence, maybe even Laugh-Tale itself. These aren't prophecies, they're calendar notifications the world can't delete, which raises the uncomfortable question we need to sit with. If Poseidon is essentially a living transmitter for Sea Kings, what exactly are Uranus and Pluton in this network? Are they just bigger guns, or are we looking at different pieces of a global communication grid? An orbital tower, a relay, a router for the planet's will? Because if that's the case, then the scariest ancient weapon might not be the one that blows things up. It might be the one that decides who gets to speak. And once you start asking who's been jamming that signal for 800 years, you're not going to look at Imu, the Mother Flame, or the Empty Throne the same way again. So let's go to the one scene where Oda basically rips the curtain open and then quietly sews it shut again before anyone panics. Zoo. Because if you're still in the Luffy is just hearing ghost feelings category, I need you to walk through this with me step by step. Zunisha is getting shelled. Mink City is about to get erased. And suddenly Luffy clutches his head. Momonosuke does the same. They both hear a voice, not through ears, but directly in their minds. Zunisha begging for permission to fight back, apologizing, looping this 800-year-old guilt script. That's our surface read. Mysterious ancient elephant, tragic backstory, cool atmosphere, moving on. Except, here's the thing. Only one of them can answer. Luffy, the guy who talks to Sea Kings, who will later hear the drums of liberation and literally sync with the world's heartbeat, can only receive, he yells, bag. But the signal doesn't route back. Meanwhile, Momonosuke, traumatized 8-year-old with a dragon problem and a family crest, gets told explicitly, you must give the order. He speaks, Zunisha hears, and the entire battlefield changes. That is not just spiritual Wi-Fi. That is command and control. So we need to name the asymmetry. Luffy is red only. Momo is red right. Same voice of all things interface, different permission levels. And Oda hammers this by tying it to history, not effort. Luffy doesn't fail to transmit because he isn't trying hard enough or because his haki isn't trained. He fails because he's missing a credential baked into the Kozuki bloodline and Wano's role in the Void Century. Listen to me. That's not vibes. That's user roles. Once you see that, Zoo stops being sad elephant arc and turns into a product demo. The voice of all things isn't one monolithic magic power. It's a tiered system. Basic reception is Luffy hearing Sea Kings and Zunisha. Advanced reception is Roger and Odin both catching the same broadcast at Sea Kings at the final island, reacting in perfect parallel. And admin level, that's Momonosuke, who doesn't just understand the packet. He can push a firmware update to a walking continent. Pattern interrupt, because I know some of you are already in the comments. You're overthinking it, it's just destiny. No. This is not a sin, but it is lazy analysis. The author is showing you a structured network. There are permissions, there are commands, there are consequences, Reframe Zunesha with that in mind. It's not just a cursed elephant doing laps as penance. It's a mobile relay tower, a living server cluster marching in circles for 800 years, still running an ancient process, await Kozuki authorization. Do not engage. When Momo Nusake speaks, he isn't soothing a ghost. He is logging in with the right key and overwriting a standing order from the Void Century, and suddenly the foreshadowing snaps into focus. If one kid can reboot an ancient weapon-adjacent giant by talking into the signal, what happens when the guy whose heartbeat is a global broadcast hits admin mode? Because if Zoo is the tutorial for permissions, the endgame is what happens when someone tries to seize root access. So if Zoo is the tutorial for permissions, we need to talk about the devs who coded the system in the first place, because the more you stare at it, the more the Kozuki clan stop looking like traditional samurai royalty and start looking suspiciously like the infrastructure team for the ancient kingdom. Here's the thing. What do we actually know, not headcanon, about Kozuki? They're stonemasons. Generations of them. They forged the poneglyphs out of some unbreakable stone, engraved them with indestructible records, and then scattered them across the world. They ruled Wano, a country that was explicitly allied with the ancient kingdom during the Void Century, and their crest and name are stapled to every major flashback involving the road to Laugh Tale. That's not flavor text. That's the author putting a giant sticky note on one family and writing core process in red pen. If you strip the fantasy paint off, what is a poneglyph? It's cold storage. It's a data shard. This community keeps calling them history rocks, but functionally they're write once read many drives distributed across the globe. The Rio poneglyph is literally a master backup of the Void Century. So when Oda tells you the Kozuki made them, he's telling you the Kozuki designed the data storage layer of the ancient world's communication system. That's not me being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. That's just following the job description. Now plug Momonosuke into that. On Zoo, both Luffy and Momo hear Zunesha, the same signal, same mysterious sense. But only Momo can send a command. Only Momo can overwrite the standing order and tell a continental weapon to move. That is a permissions issue, not a destiny sparkle. I need you to see how surgical that is. Voice of all things is reception. Kozuki blood is transmission with admin privileges. Momo isn't random chosen child. He's the current holder of the Kozuki root key for the network his ancestors physically carved into the planet. And then there's Wano's isolation. The fandom treats it as geography, big waterfalls, closed borders, samurai xenophobia. This is fine on a surface level. But if the Kozuki are the storage engineers, Wano isn't just a hidden country, it's a locked server room. Opening the borders stops reading as a tourism policy and starts reading as disabling a firewall around a critical node until Joy Boy's signal comes back online. Odin wanting to open Wano, Toki jumping forward, the borders only opening when the right broadcast hits the world. That sounds planned in a very specific systems architecture way, which raises the next problem. If Kozuki built the storage and command layer, who built the transmission layer? Who built the towers, the antennas, the power supply? Because that's where Uranus, Pluton, Poseidon, and now the Mother Flame start looking less random superweapons and more world-scale routers and reactors. And if that's true, the foreshadowing around them has been hiding in plain sight. So if the ancient weapons are the cell towers and reactors, we need to talk about the moment Oda quietly shows you a cheap little receiver booting up in real time. And it's not an ancient weapon. It's not a god. It's a boat. It's the Straw Hat's goofy lion-faced house. During the raid on Onigashima, in the middle of absolute chaos, there's this tiny beat most fans just meme-scrolled past. Luffy is mid-fight, fully locked in on Kaido, and he suddenly snaps his head, eyes wide, and goes, not, the ship might be in danger. Not, I'm worried about my ride. He reacts as if he literally heard a voice, a scream, from a ship miles away through a war, through the sky. Here's the thing. Up to now, the voice of all things has been a very specific category in the community's brain. King's talking at Fishman Island? Sure. Huge ancient creatures, mystical. Zunesha begging for permission on Zoo? Fine. Giant cursed elephant. whatever. Even the drums of liberation in Gear 5 can be waved away as metaphor. But a wooden object pinging Luffy's brain with a distress call that breaks the informal rulebook we all built. This is the first time the story makes Luffy explicitly react to the voice of a ship. Not a creature, not a crowd, not a living mass. That is Oda walking over to the whiteboard and silently adding a new column. Inanimate objects with will. And he does it in Wano, in the same arc where he's already tying Zunisha, the Kozuki, and the Poneglyph network together. You think that timing is accidental? Remember, ships in One Piece are already treated as having a kind of soul. The Going Merry literally manifests a Klabauterman. Usopp talks to her. She sails one last time to save the crew. That whole storyline is Oda training you to accept that intense emotional imprint can crystallize into a spirit on a ship. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is Oda preloading the category, so when the Sunny cries, your brain doesn't short-circuit. And the Thousand Sunny is not just any boat. It's built from Adam Wood, the same legendary material tied to world-scale events. It's been fed blood, tears, and an absolutely stupid number of near-death experiences. I need you to see it as a node, a minor transmitter on the same ancient network we just accused Uranus and friends of powering. The crew pours will in, the Adam Wood holds it, the signal leaks out. Luffy, whose body is already tuned to that frequency, picks it up mid-battle as easily as you hear your phone buzz during a meeting. From a writing perspective, this feels like later stage refinement. Early on, Oda plays with ship spirits as metaphor. Then he formalizes the voice of all things with Roger and the Sea Kings. By Wano, he's retrofitting those metaphors into a single intentional system where beloved objects can join the network. And if a tiny pirate ship can cry on that frequency, what happens when an entire island starts screaming? And if a tiny pirate ship can cry on that frequency, what happens when an entire god starts laughing on it? Because that's what Gear 5 is. It's not just a power-up, it's a full system broadcast. So, quick recap of the scene you've watched 12 times on YouTube compilations. Luffy's heart stops. We cut to the rooftop. Then it starts again, but wrong. Or rather, too right. His heartbeat shifts into that doom-da-da rhythm, and suddenly characters all over Onigashima are flinching. They're not sensing haki. They're literally hearing something. Then Zunisha, the walking fossilized server rack from the Void Century, goes, I hear it, the drums of liberation. Joy Boy has returned. Here's the thing. Up to this point, the voice of all things has been treated as this private radio in Luffy's skull. He hears the Sea Kings. He hears Zunisha on Zoo. He hears the Sunny. Most people around him hear nothing, and just assume their captain is an overconfident himbo arguing with the air. That's been the pattern. Receiver mode only. Signal comes in, Luffy picks it up. End of story. But the drums? The drums break the pattern. The sound is diegetic. People without Conqueror's haki react. This is a category error if you're still filing all of this under mysterious sixth sense. This isn't Luffy tuning into the network. This is the network suddenly hearing him. The signal stops being a whisper in his head and becomes a physical phenomenon in the environment. That's a hard escalation, not a cute parallel. And Zunisha's response is, the smoking gun here. This elephant has been wandering for 1,000 years as punishment, allegedly, and yet one specific rhythm instantly flips a flag in its brain. Joy Boy. Not that strong haki. Not wow, impressive fruit awakening. A proper noun. A stored identity. That means this beat is a trigger signal encoded into the world's oldest nodes. Zunisha isn't guessing, it's recognizing a password. So I need you to stop treating Gear 5 as just Toon Force but rubber. Gear 5 is broadcast mode. Awakening doesn't only change the environment visually, it syncs Luffy's entire body, heart, fruit, will, to the same frequency Joy Boy used when the system was first built. The drums of liberation are the handshake protocol. When their heartbeat starts, every compatible receiver on the planet is, in theory, able to log on. From a foreshadowing perspective, this is not a sin. This is not random. Oda has been quietly showing us receiver-side scenes for years. Roger hearing the Sea Kings, Odin hearing the same thing, Momonosuke transmitting to Zanesha. Gear 5 is the planned payoff where we flip to transmitter side. Suddenly the protagonist isn't just a guy with good reception, he's a living antenna. And if your protagonist is an antenna, the end game cannot just be punching a tall shadow on a throne. We need to accept that the final war is a clash of signals. Joy Boy's liberating broadcast versus the world government's suppressive control. Mother Flame, ancient weapons, the world's voice going quiet after the Void Century. These stop being lore trivia and start reading as infrastructure for a censorship machine. Listen to me. When Luffy laughs and the world hears drums, that's not hype flare, that's the author turning the global router back on. And the real question for the next section is, who else is already on that call, and who's trying to cut the wire? But when I say global router, I'm not being cute. I'm being literal in One Piece terms, because once you rewatch the series with that in mind, Joy Boy stops feeling like a dead guy with good PR and starts reading as a recurring network state the world keeps trying to boot up. Here's the thing. What do we actually know textually about Joy Boy? 800 years ago, he leaves an apology on a poneglyph. He's tied to the ancient kingdom, to Poseidon, to a broken promise involving Fishman Island and Noah, and there's this persistent implication that he was supposed to come back. Our community talks about this as if we're waiting on a specific dude to respawn. One soul, one destiny slot. That's the default fanfiction, right? But I need you to consider a different category. Not reincarnation, configuration. Joy Boy, as a pattern the world can enter when three things line up. A certain will, a certain body, and a certain signal. Not Roger failed so Luffy inherited his ghost, but Roger almost hit the same operating system. Luffy finally finished the install. The drums are the giveaway. The drums of liberation are presented as sound, sure, but narratively they behave more like a signature waveform, a recognizable frequency. Every time Luffy's heart sinks to that beat in Gear 5, characters don't just say, wow, new form. They say, he's here. Zunisha calls it Joy Boy. The world reacts as if a long-missing broadcast just came back online. That isn't foreshadowing for a twist about heritage. That's the author quietly telling you this is a login chime. And then Oda pulls the rug on the fruit. Gomu Gomu no Mi was a mislabel. It's the Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika, a human fruit whose model is literally a liberation deity tied to drums and laughter. That is absurdly on the nose as a biological key. Eat this, and your rubber body isn't just cartoon physics, it's a tuner. Your cells, your heartbeat, your nervous system become hardware that can lock onto the Joy Boy signal the same way a tone dial locks onto sound. This is not a sin, by the way. This is not lazy writing. This is Oda doing planned, structural storytelling and then hiding it under gags for 25 years. But Joy Boy stops being that one ancient kingdom guy and becomes a recurring login state. Whenever someone's will to free others, their Nika-tuned body, and the world's dormant network all resonate, the drums play and the system tags that user as Joy Boy. Roger brushed it. Luffy finally clicks connect, which means we need to talk about the counter signal. Because if Joy Boy is a liberating pattern that reactivates an 800-year-old communication grid, then Imu and the world government are not just evil monarchs. They're long-term signal jammers. The Mother Flame, the erased islands, the way the world's voice goes silent around certain events. Those start reading as deliberate interference. And if Luffy is now a walking broadcast tower, you have to ask, what happens when the jammer notices the tower and fires back? So when the jammer fires back, what is it aiming at? It's not aiming at a bomb, it's aiming at a broadcast tower. And this is where we need to completely rewrite the way the community talks about ancient weapons. Because the official line is very clear. They can destroy the world. Fans see that and immediately go, ah, cool, fantasy nukes, giant cannons, end of discussion. This is not a sin. This is normal. You hear world-ending power. Your brain goes to mushroom clouds, not to network infrastructure. But listen to me. That phrasing is vague on purpose. Destroy the world does not have to mean physically vaporize the planet. It can mean erase the current configuration of power, blow up the operating system, not the hardware. Here's the thing. If the world in One Piece is fundamentally a controlled signal, news, history, weather, roots, even memory, then an ancient weapon that can destroy the world might just be a device that can overwrite that signal. Not a gun, a master remote. You don't need to melt Maria Joie if you can turn off the world government's broadcast and turn on Joy Boys. Same destruction, different category. We already have a canon example pushing us in this direction. Poseidon. Shirahoshi's weapon power is commanding sea kings. That is not a bomb, that is logistics. That is living infrastructure. These things tow Noah, they ferry people, they cross calm belts the way you or I cross the street. When Roger hears the Sea Kings at Fishman Island, when Luffy hears them later, that's not two ghost moments. That's two users on the same network hearing the same traffic. Poseidon is less super laser and more root admin of the ocean layer. So extend that pattern. If Poseidon is sea-based control, what on earth is Pluton doing being a ship? Why is the most dangerous weapon a vehicle? Because a ship is a moving conduit. I need you to stop picturing Pluton as a pirate Death Star and start picturing it as a planetary scale router or engine, something that can physically carry, amplify or anchor the signal through the Grand Line's insane magnetic fields. A mobile node that lets the real broadcast reach everywhere it's supposed to. And Uranus? The name alone screams sky. In a story that keeps flirting with space, moons, and weird weather, the sky weapon being an orbital or upper atmosphere transmitter is not a stretch. Sea-based nodes through Sea Kings, land/root conduit through Pluton, sky-based carrier through Uranus. That's not 3 random doomsday buttons, that's a 3-part global network. Pattern interrupt. What if the Void Century wasn't an age of war over superweapons, but an age of Wi-Fi? An ancient kingdom that built a world-spanning communication and energy grid, tuned to the voice of all things, so anyone could hear the truth if they were awakened to it. If you're the faction that overthrows that system, you have a branding problem. You cannot tell people, we destroyed the free global broadcast. You call them weapons. You say they almost destroyed the world. You turn routers into nukes by PR. And suddenly the foreshadowing around poneglyphs, as recorded Will, Roger and Odin, hearing the world, and Luffy's drums as a broadcast starts reading as the same planned system coming back online, which raises the real endgame question. If the ancient weapons are transmitters, who exactly is supposed to be speaking through them when they're finally all turned on? So here's where we need to stop treating the Void Century as mysterious fantasy backstory and start treating it as a terms of service violation. Because if the ancient weapons are transmitters, then the Void Century isn't just a lost era, it's a deleted internet. You know the official summary. 100 years of history scrubbed, an unnamed ancient kingdom defeated, the world government founded on the corpse, and the only surviving records are indestructible stone monoliths written in a dead language. This is not subtle. This is not a normal regime change. This is an author screaming, someone factory reset the planet, and trusting that you, pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, will eventually notice. Here's the thing. When you reframe those 100 years as a previous version of the world's operating system, all the weird details snap into a planned category. The ancient kingdom isn't just a big nation that lost, it's the original server hub. Their crime wasn't existing. Their crime was running a world where everyone, or at least every major power, was synced to a shared network of will, information, and maybe even sound. And then the victors pulled the plug, hard, and wrote a new patch notes document called 800 Years of Propaganda. The poneglyphs are your first clue. These are not normal historical records. They're basically stone hard drives, read-only, distributed backups of the old net, shoved into caves and sky islands so the new admins can't fully wipe them. The ancient weapons, that's the core infrastructure that somehow survived the uninstall. Pluton, Poseidon, Uranus, Zunisha stomping around on ping from one specific bloodline. Those are the last routers still technically online but disconnected from everyday users. The day-to-day connectivity, the background hum of everyone hearing and being heard, is what's gone. And the world government's real sin is right there. Not just conquest, AD, control of signal. They don't only decide borders, they decide bandwidth. What can be heard? What can be remembered? What wills are allowed to propagate and which get throttled to zero? Erasing O'Hara wasn't about books. It was about killing off one of the last communities trying to reassemble the old network topology from those stone backups. Listen to me. This is why the voice of all things keeps getting framed as forbidden, dangerous, or those who can hear it will one day shake the world. It's not magic ghost talk. It's unauthorized access to a legacy system the government has spent 8 centuries firewalling. So when Luffy walks around accidentally hearing Sea Kings, chatting with Zunesha, picking up the Sunny's distress, and then turning his heartbeat into a global broadcast, that's a reboot sequence. I need you to clock how intentional this feels in the writing. Roger hears the same signal, reaches laugh tail, laughs at the punchline of the old world, and is too early to log everyone back in. Luffy is the patch, which means the endgame is not just topple the government. It's turn the network back on and force the world's will to go public again. And if that's true, then we have to ask a much uglier question. Who benefits most from keeping the world permanently on airplane mode? The answer, obviously, is the weird little gremlin sitting on the empty throne, pretending it's a gamer chair. Emu is the personification of airplane mode, and I need you to remember how they were introduced. Not with a speech, not with a buster call, but as a shadow drifting through the Pangaea castle, casually slicing up wanted posters before strolling into the room that is supposed to be permanently, this is the throne that tells the whole world no one rules everything. And Oda just goes, actually, here's a silhouette sitting on it, holding centuries of reverence at gunpoint. Then we get the real horror. The Gorosei bowing, talking about that person, and an order that results in Lulusia Island being erased so hard the narrator acts confused about its existence. That's not just political power, but is admin access to the save file. Enter the Mother Flame. We're told it's this hyper-concentrated energy source, Vegapunk adjacent, but the beam that nukes Lulusia is not science just advanced a bit, it's Void Sentry grade hardware. It's the same category of impossible as Pluton and Uranus. Technology that should not exist in a post-O'Hara world, yet is being casually fired as a warning shot. And here's the thing. You do not build a gun that can delete islands without first understanding the deeper system those islands are sitting in. So we need to talk about jamming. If this world runs on a hidden network of wills and voices, then the Mother Flame isn't just a laser. It's a proof of concept that someone can grab the underlying frequency and brute force it. If you can focus enough energy to vaporize a country, you can absolutely redirect or drown out a signal. Same tech, different setting. Think less Death Star and more global noise-cancelling headphones strapped around the planet. Listen to me, the truly terrifying read on Emu is not, they can blow up your house. The terrifying read is they can decide which histories are audible. The Void Sentry is not only erased from books, it is emotionally, spiritually muted. Boy Boy's apology, the poneglyphs, Zunesha's wandering sentence that never ends, those are fragments that slip past the firewall. Imu's real job might be maintaining a monopoly on what the world is allowed to feel as true. So when Luffy drums on reality and people start hearing sounds they do not have the vocabulary for, that is not random hype, that is a competing broadcast booting up. Authoritarian systems survive by keeping everything on one channel. Luffy is a walking mesh network whose body refuses to stay on the approved wavelength. This is not a sin. This is intentional, structural storytelling. And if the Mother Flame is the hardware for suppression, then somewhere buried in the ancient weapons and Laugh Tale's punchline, there has to be the hardware for amplification. The question is, when that second system comes online, does the world actually want to hear what it's been missing? So if the world has a suppressed hardware system, and we're waiting for the amplifier to boot up, I need you to remember the one island Oda has been dangling in front of us for 20 plus years. Elbaf, the land of giants, the place Usopp has been screaming about since East Blue, the island that keeps getting name dropped, smiled at, and then carefully dodged in the actual story. Here's the thing. Elbaf is not just the cool Viking arc the community has been begging for. It's already structurally wired into 3 of the biggest information threads in the story. Usopp's dream of becoming a brave warrior of the sea? That's a dream about stories, about being the guy who carries tales across generations every single week. Jaguar D. Sowell's Survival After O'Hara. That's the last living bridge between the world's dead knowledge and a hidden giant society. And the O'Hara books themselves, hauled out of a burning island and preserved somewhere in the New World, Oda straight up told you where they went. They went to the giants. Giants in One Piece have a very specific narrative category. They're not subtle masterminds. They're not schemers. They are walking, yelling wills with axes. Dory and Broggy on Little Garden Jewel for 100 years over a forgotten reason, but never dropped the promise. The Elbaf warriors in Big Mom's flashback have this almost religious obsession with honor. Oimo and Kashi sit outside Eni's lobby for 50 years because their captors told them a story and they believed it. That's not a gag. That's foreshadowing for what giants are in the system. Long-lived, stubborn, absolutely committed storage devices for narrative. Now, stretch that into the signal model. If voice in One Piece is shorthand for spiritual wavelength, then giants are walking subwoofers. Their bodies are huge, their lifespans are centuries, their convictions are cartoonishly straightforward. So if Will has a volume knob, theirs is stuck on max. When a giant makes a promise, that thing probably pings the world's network for generations. This is not a sin. This is intentional design. The author keeps showing you that giant vows echo across absurd stretches of time because he's teaching you that their voices are inherently louder. Pattern interrupt. What if Elbaf isn't just big people and big trees, but the loudest Wi-Fi hub on the planet? Listen to me. Saul plus the O'Hara Library turns that island into a dual-core server. On one side, you have physical data. The books, the research, the diagrams of the Void Century that Robin's mentors died to protect. On the other side, you have living nodes. An entire population of high-volume wills, plus at least one D, have already chose to defy the world government once. We need to see that for what it is. That's not just a sentimental reunion arc. That's the perfect environment to reconstruct the lost signal of history. Written records to decode the content, and giant voices to blast it across the world. And when Luffy finally steps onto Elbaf, do not be surprised if he starts hearing things before anyone even opens a book. The creaking of some colossal world tree that remembers the Void Century. The distant laughter of ancient warriors whose promises never shut up. Maybe the entire island hums in rhythm with the drums of liberation, and suddenly the voice of all things stops being this vague ghost power and turns into a full-on broadcast demo. Because if Oda's been pre-writing a global network, Elbaf is where he hands you the speakers and asks, are you actually ready to hear this at full volume? So if Elbaf is where Oda hands you the speakers, Egghead is where he sits you down in a lab and says, okay, now we're going to take this thing apart. This is not a random detour. In the first island in the series that is structurally built to talk about the signal in universe without anyone having to say the word magic. Egghead is absurd on purpose. You've got Vegapunk's island running on lasers, holograms, solid light food printers, seraphim, artificial weather, and a literal brain tower on the horizon. The whole place is staged to feel centuries ahead of the rest of the world, because it is. Punk Records is basically a floating hard drive of human thought, a shared brain in the sky that every Vegapunk clone can read and write to. You don't need to squint. Oda is putting a cloud server in a world that still thinks transponder snails are cutting edge. And here's the thing. That cloud brain is a diet version of the ancient network we've been talking about. Punk Records is a localized, man-made test case for a much older, planet-scale system where wills, memories, and voices are all riding the same wavelength. Vegapunk is not inventing a new paradigm. He's reverse engineering an old one with worse UI. We need to stop treating him as the quirky genius who broke reality and start reading him as the guy desperately trying to rebuild something he half remembers from a blueprint he was never supposed to see. Because Vegapunk has seen things. The story hammers this. He knows the Void Century exists. He knows the O'Hara scholars died for getting too close. He's read their books, walked their burned library, and connected it to his own forbidden research. The man literally says his brain is too full of dangerous knowledge. That is foreshadowing, not flavor text. That's the author waving a sign that says, this scientist has glimpsed the original operating system the ancient kingdom was running. When he plays with the mother flame, when he toys with artificial devil fruits, When he tries to reproduce mythical abilities, you're supposed to hear a subtext. He's poking at the world's underlying wavelength with a stick. Mother Flame is not just a big battery. It's a proof of concept that you can plug into whatever Imu is already hijacking. His devil fruit research is framed around the idea that fruits are crystallized desires, stored somewhere in the sea of imagination. Listen to me. That is signal language. That is literally a scientist trying to formalize the voice of all things without realizing that's what he's naming. And this all loops back to Luffy. Egghead is the collision point where the mythical chosen one who hears voices interpretation runs headfirst into Rubber Idiot whose body is accidentally tuned to an ancient frequency. I need you to notice how often Vegapunk's dialogue brushes up against Luffy's fruit, Nika, and the concept of inherited will without quite connecting them. That gap is intentional. It's the author holding the last puzzle piece off screen. Because sooner or later, someone on Egghead is going to say the quiet part out loud. They're going to look at Luffy's drums, his Gear 5 reality warping, his habit of hearing things no one else can, and they're going to reach for technological metaphors. Antenna, receiver, broadcast. And once the story gives you those words, this is not a sin, this is normal. The community will retroactively realize the ghosts were a network all along, which sets up the real nightmare scenario. If Vegapunk is rebuilding the radio, who's been running the station for 800 years, and what happens when Luffy starts broadcasting on their channel instead? I say, who's been running the station? I need you to remember what Vegapunk already told you about the hardware. Devil fruits are possibilities for human evolution that someone wished for, not random superpowers, not gacha pulls. Intentional fantasies crystallized into a system that can overwrite your body, your senses, your interface with reality. Here's the thing. If the core mechanic of a devil fruit is rewrite the user, why would that stop at muscles and elements? Why wouldn't it extend to whatever invisible Wi-Fi the story keeps hinting at? We keep treating fruits as spell scrolls. Phylogea, rubber, paramecia, animal, zoan. And simple category, simple payoff. You eat the flame fruit, you get fire. End of tutorial. But what if the real function is, you eat the flame fruit, your entire being gets tuned to the conceptual pattern of fire, and suddenly you're on that wavelength the way a radio locks onto AM 730. That's the modulation idea. Fruits don't just hand you powers, they drag your frequency into alignment with a specific archetype. Fire, lightning, shadow, rubber, and in the mythical zone, it stops being just element and becomes story. The Buddha fruit isn't a random golden giant. It's a body tuned to the Buddha archetype, compassion, enlightenment, radiant presence. The Yamata no Orochi isn't just many heads. It's a cursed, tyrannical serpent myth, encoded as a signal pattern the world already recognizes. Mythical zoans are where the author basically stops pretending this is simple biology. These are fruits tied to legends that predate the world government, that the community inside the story responds to instinctively. People see Sengoku and they don't go, wow, rare cow model. They respond to the idea of Buddha. That's a conceptual broadcast. These myths have their own signatures, their own songs embedded in the fabric of the world, and the fruit forces the user to match pitch. Which brings us to the problem child, Nika. Oda went out of his way to tell you this is not the gum anything. It's a human model, a mythical figure whose whole deal is joy, freedom, and making the impossible into a cartoon. Fans keep stopping at Toon Force. Funny faces, physics break, end of analysis. This is not a sin. This is normal. We see wacky panels, our pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast goes, gag power. But if Nika is an archetype with its own ancient signal, then eating that fruit doesn't just give Luffy goofy rubber, it phase locks his body and will to the Joy Boy waveform. The drums of liberation aren't background music, they're the carrier wave. Gear 5 is broadcast mode. When he laughs, when the world hears those drums, that's the network recognizing a frequency it hasn't picked up cleanly in 800 years. And now we need to talk about the guy who keeps hoarding antennas. Black beard, weird body, multiple fruits, every rule of the system bent around him. If each fruit is a tuner to a different channel, then Teach isn't just stacking elements, he's wiring himself into multiple conceptual bands at once. Darkness, tremor, potential third mystery slot, a one-man pirate radio tower, punching holes in the spectrum. So ask yourself, what happens when a Joyboy broadcast slams into a walking signal thief? So when that Joyboy broadcast slams into a walking signal thief, we need to talk about the people holding the radios, because the world can hum all it wants. If nobody's tuned in, it's just cosmic background noise. That's where Hacky walks in, kicks off its shoes, and quietly reveals it's been the user interface for this whole system since Chapter 1. Here's the thing. On the surface, Hacky is three neat categories: observation to sense presence and intent, armament to reinforce your body or weapon, conquerors to overwhelm others with raw will and knock the weak out cold. The community treats these as battle mechanics, power scaling fuel. This is fine, this is normal. But if the signal is the hardware layer of the world, then Hacky is the software running on each individual user. It's your operating system for reading and writing will. Observation first. In story, it's sold as hearing people's presence, predicting attacks, feeling emotions. Skypiea calls it mantra. Enel treats it as a god's surveillance system. But notice the constraint. It's local, room scale. You're pinging nearby devices on the network. When Luffy senses Katakuri's future attacks, he's not communing with the universe. He's just got really good Wi-Fi in a small arena. The voice of all things is not that. The voice is when the OS briefly accesses a deeper, global layer. Fishman Island. Luffy hears the Sea Kings the same way Roger did in Oden's flashback. Zoo. He and Momonosuke both hear Zunesha's ancient voice, but only Momo can transmit a command. Wano Luffy hears the Thousand Sunny crying out as it's almost burned. That's not strong observation. That's a different API call. Observation is your minimap. Voice of all things is tapping the server logs of history and living will. Armament fits cleanly too. If the signal is constantly pressing on reality, armament is hardening your device so it can handle higher voltages. You're reinforcing your body as an antenna and shield, letting more will current pass through without frying you. That's why advanced armament literally changes how your blows interact with the inside of objects. You're shaping how the signal writes into matter. Now, conquerors. Listen to me. Conquerors is just broadcast. Strip away the cool lightning, and it's a brute force, high-volume transmission of your will that crashes weaker operating systems. You're not intimidating people, you're DDoSing their consciousness with your signal until they hard reset. When Luffy and Kaido's clash never even touches and the sky splits. That's two pirate radio towers blasting incompatible streams so hard the environment glitches. And this is where Luffy becomes terrifying from a writing perspective. Because he hasn't just mastered all three Hacky types in the standard shonen training arc sense. He's unknowingly optimized every layer of the OS while holding the one devil fruit that rewrites the rules of the hardware. Gear 5 doesn't just bend matter, it warps the signal itself into a cartoon logic channel, complete with drums of liberation as an audible broadcast. I need you to see what Oda's foreshadowing here. If Hacky is the operating system and the world's will is the network, then Luffy is being positioned as the ideal super user account. Observation, armament, conquerors, plus the Nika fruit, plus the voice of all things. That's not chosen one nonsense. That's a technical spec sheet for the one person who can fully exploit an 800-year-old communication system when it finally boots back up. Which raises a much dumber, much scarier question. If Luffy is the super user, who's been holding root access this whole time? So to answer that who's holding root access question, we need receipts. We need to actually map every time Luffy hears something he shouldn't and see if this is a random haunting or a software changelog. Start with Marineford. Luffy isn't hearing a monster or an ancient weapon. He's hearing death. As Ace's Vivre card burns away, Oda draws this collapsing roar of voices in Luffy's head. The world going silent except for that fading will. The distance is intimate, physical, right in front of him. No one else reacts. Narratively, Luffy is at his lowest emotional point in the story, and the signal is at its weakest. One person, one life, cutting out in real time. I'd file this as retrofitting that accidentally lines up. At the time, it reads as trauma. In hindsight, it's the first audible glitch in the system. Then Fishman Island rips the ceiling off. Suddenly Luffy is hearing sea kings, massive, ancient, kilometers away, conversing across the ocean during Shirahoshi's awakening. Nobody on the battlefield hears them. Luffy and Shirahoshi react. The manga directly echoes Roger's identical reaction in Oden's flashback. This is no longer vibes. This is an intentional parallel hardwired to the voice of all things terminology. Category-wise, this is foreshadowing built on pre-writing. Oda already knew Roger and Luffy share a spec. He's now stress-testing range and scale. Zune escalates again. Zunesha is not just distant, it's a walking continent. Luffy and Momonosuke both hear the elephant's plea from across the island, over the ambient noise of an entire civilization. No one else picks up anything. Here's the thing, Momo can transmit, Luffy can only receive. That's a new rule. The signal isn't just broadcast. Certain users have two-way access. This feels heavily pre-written because it dovetails too cleanly with the later Command Zunisha in Wano payoff. Wano gives us the Thousand Sunny moment, which the community massively undersells. In the fire, Luffy hears the Sunny crying from a totally different part of Onigashima, not metaphorically. He stops and reacts to a ship. Distance. Hundreds of meters through stone and chaos. Emotional state mid-war, furious but focused. The source. An object infused with Frankie's craft and the crew's will. That pushes the system from ancient beings to anything that's accumulated enough intent. This is not a sin. This is not bad power creep. This is Oda quietly expanding the category of what can broadcast. And then Gear 5 hits and the drums of liberation start. Everyone hears the sound, but only certain characters understand it as a will coming online. Luffy isn't just listening anymore. His heartbeat is the signal. He's syncing with Joy Boy's track and turning his body into the tower that pings the whole world. Means. When you line these up, Marineford's dying will, Fishman Island's sea gods, Zoo's living continent, Wano's crying ship, the global drums, you don't get 5 ghost stories. You get an iterative feature rollout of one communication mechanic the author has been refining for a decade, which leads to the really uncomfortable question, if the world has a network, who built the hardware, and what happens when someone tries to unplug it? So if the world has a network, we need to actually map the thing. Not vibes, not mystical destiny, but a literal topology. Who's receiving, who's broadcasting, who's storing the data so it survives 800 years of government-sponsored factory reset, but with receivers. That's your Luffy, Roger, Oden, Momonosuke category. Individuals who can tune into the voice of all things, but with different bandwidths. Luffy hears the Sea Kings at Fishman Island and goes, huh, noisy ocean. Roger hears the same thing in Oden's flashback and laughs because he already knows it's a channel, not a haunting. Oden hears the voices of the poneglyphs. Momo hears Zunisha and, crucially, can answer. Receivers aren't special because the author hand-waved Chosen One. They're special because their will is physically compatible with a pre-existing signal. Then you've got transmitters. Here's the thing. Joy Boy Leaker isn't just a guy. He's a waveform. The drums of liberation are not metaphorical. They're a literal broadcast. When Luffy hits Gear 5 and the drums start, the whole world doesn't suddenly gain new ears. The transmitter just cranks to max output. Poseidon is the same category. Shirahoshi doesn't politely talk to Sea Kings. She issues global commands to continent-sized modems. And the ancient weapons in general are almost certainly hardware-level broadcasters of will or energy. You don't name something Pluton and then have it be a glorified cannon. You name it that because it can overwrite the world's operating system. Now, relays and storage. This is where the community undersells the foreshadowing. Poneglyphs are recorded will, yes, but functionally they're hard drives. Zunesha is a walking, weeping server rack, carrying an 800-year-old process it still hasn't been allowed to terminate. Sea Kings are roaming repeaters, passing on Joy Boy's promise and Poseidon's orders. And certain locations, Laugh Tale, Wano, behave as hubs or data centers where multiple lines converge. Laugh Tale is where Roger heard the whole story and just died laughing at the patch notes. So verbally diagram this with me. The ancient kingdom originates a message, their history, their warning, their liberation protocol. They encode it into poneglyphs and into living systems. Zunesha's command, the Sea King's mission, the Nika signal baked into a devil fruit. Those nodes wander the world for centuries, routing fragments of the same pattern. Modern receivers, Roger, Odin, Momo, Luffy, pick up pieces. But until someone can both read and respond, it's a one-way archive, not a conversation. Which is where Luffy breaks the category. He's a receiver. He hears Sea King, Zunesha, even the Thousand Sunny's voice in Wano. But with Nika and the drums of liberation, he turns into a transmitter. His heartbeat is a global broadcast. When he laughs, the world's signal spikes. Listen to me. That means history isn't just being uncovered, it's being resent. The old message about Joy Boy isn't stuck on stone anymore. It's booting on fresh hardware. And if Luffy is a living antenna, then I need you to ask the uncomfortable sequel question. Who's trying to jam the signal, and what happens when their firewall finally collides with this broadcast? So we've built this whole Luffy is an antenna thing. Cool theory, fun party trick. But we need to do the boring adult work now and ask, what category is this actually in? Is this real foreshadowing? Is it retrofitting? Or is it that third cursed option, pre-writing? Quick refresher, because the community mashes these together constantly. Foreshadowing is intentional setup. The author knows the payoff, plants a seed early, and cashes it out later. Retrofitting is when the author goes back to old material that wasn't carrying specific meaning and assigns new significance after the fact. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is normal. And pre-writing is when the big decisions, endgame, mysteries, core mechanics exist before chapter 1, and what we call foreshadowing is just the slow reveal of a blueprint that was already locked in. So where does the signal theory sit? Here's the thing. The Roger, Laffy, Sea King parallels are almost textbook pre-writing plus foreshadowing. Oda doesn't just have Luffy hear random sea monsters at Fishman Island. He has him react in the exact same way Roger did in Odin's flashback, with the narration explicitly flagging the voice of all things. That is not a coincidence. That is an author showing you, on purpose, this kid is plugged into the same system the Pirate King was. Zunesha is even more surgical. On Zoo, Luffy and Momonosuke both receive the signal, but only Momo can transmit a command. That's an admin panel. That's a network with permissions. You don't stumble into that structure by accident 20 years in. You get that when you pre-write a metaphysical communication system and then foreshadow its rules in stages. Now on the other side, I think some stuff is almost certainly retrofit. When Luffy hears the Thousand Sunny crying in Wano, beautiful moment, great character beat, but that ship didn't always need a literal voice. Early on, the going merry spirit is framed more as emotional metaphor than hard mechanic. Same with some of the more poetic, hearing the voices of the world lines. Those sound to me like Oda realizing, over time, that this wavelength idea can stretch from Sea Kings and Zunesha out to ships, drums, maybe even the planet itself, and just using it more. And listen to me, this is fine. Retrofitting doesn't break the system. It proves there is a system robust enough to absorb new expressions without snapping. It's Oda discovering the full potential of his own toy box and integrating those discoveries back into the ongoing story instead of leaving them in a notebook. Pattern interrupt. If you're currently muttering you're overthinking it at your screen, I need you to hear how many independent elements are all humming on this same metaphor. Sea Kings, Zunesha, poneglyphs as recorded will, the drums of liberation, the ancient weapons implied as world-scale transmitters. At some point, you're not a brave skeptic, you're a pattern-seeking monkey who only sees Jesus in toast when the toast is also holding a poneglyph and yelling in Sea King. The difference is density. 1 or 2 echoes is coincidence. 5 or 6 systems, across decades all converging on voices, signals and wills being broadcast and received. That's an author working off a planned communication framework, then retrofitting extra poetry onto it. Which means if Luffy is a living antenna, the real question for the endgame isn't, is this foreshadowed? It's, who else did Oda quietly wire into the network that we still haven't recognized? Because once you see the categories clearly, you start spotting the final receivers and the one terrifying jammer, we haven't talked about yet. And here's where we need to talk about the enemy. Not Imu, not the Gurusei, the real final boss of One Piece discourse. Our own pattern-seeking monkey brains. Because listen to me, humans are wired to connect dots that are not dots. You hand us 3 random panels of a straw hat, a crescent moon, and a seagull, and suddenly there's a 4-0 tweet thread about how Oda secretly confirmed that the hat is an ancient weapon powered by lunar birds. Meanwhile, the same people scroll past Roger and Luffy reacting with the exact same line to the Sea Kings and go, coincidence. This is the Jesus in toast problem. Someone burns their breakfast, there's a vaguely face-shaped scorch mark, and now it's a miracle. In our community, that's when a background marine happens to be standing under a cross-shaped mast, and suddenly he's definitely a secret D. But when Oda literally shows Luffy and Momonosuke hearing Zunisha, framed side by side with Roger and Oden hearing the same kind of voice, half the comments are, maybe it's just hacky. Here's the thing, both tendencies are real. We invent conspiracy boards out of panel layouts and then ignore the author screaming in 7.2-point font, this is the same mysterious sense. That's not a moral failing. This is not a sin. This is normal. So when I build this whole Luffy is a receiver/broadcaster in a world of encoded will theory, I need you to keep that in mind. Some of the connections I'm making totally could be overreach. Maybe the one visual echo between the drums of liberation and the Sea King's song is just aesthetic rhyme. Maybe Oda just thought it would be cool. That happens. Authors are allowed to vibe. But the core pattern is not Toast Jesus. The Sea Kings at Fishman Island echoing Roger. Zunisha talking to Luffy and Momo on Zou, with Momo explicitly transmitting a command. The Thousand Sunnies speaking on Onigashima in the exact same narrative category as those other voices. Poneglyphs defined as voices of the past that only certain people can read. That's not random scorch marks. That's the same wavelength being dramatized over and over until even a goldfish should get it. So be healthily skeptical. Argue in the comments about whether a specific scene is true foreshadowing, a retrofit, or just thematic parallel. This is fine. That's half the fun. You don't have to buy every antenna I'm pointing at to appreciate the larger communication framework Oda is building. What we need to retire is the binary where either Oda is a 4D chess god who planned every eyebrow angle in 1997, or he's just tripping forward and we're seeing clouds in the wallpaper. The reality is messier and way more interesting. A hyper-documented, partially pre-written endgame, plus decades of iterative, opportunistic genius. And once you accept that messy, networked mythos, a new question opens up. If our monkey brains are this bad at sorting signal from noise, how do you tell when Oda himself is deliberately shaking the radio? So when a new chapter drops and Luffy does the, "Ha, I hear something" face, you already know what the community comments are going to be. Oh, there he goes. Luffy hears ghosts again. He's talking to the sea's souls. Haha. Very funny, very memeable. Also, completely sandblasting the most intentional mystery system Oda has been slow cooking for 25 years. Listen to me. The problem isn't that the phrase exists. The problem is that it's become the default category. Every time we file a new Voice of All Things moment under Ghost Chat, we're doing the storytelling equivalent of shrugging at a Chekhov's gun and saying, prop department. It collapses an entire network of foreshadowing into a vague supernatural shrug, which then gives everyone permission to stop thinking about how those scenes talk to each other across arcs. Here's the thing. When you say Luffy hears ghosts, you erase the pattern. Fishman Island, he hears the Sea Kings, and Oda literally mirrors Roger's reaction from Oden's flashback. Zou, Luffy and Momonosuke both hear Zunisha, but only Momo can transmit a command. 1-0, he hears the Thousand Sunny crying out as it's about to burn. Egghead. The drums of liberation kick in, and suddenly the whole world is reacting to a rhythm. That's not random ghost chatter. That's a design system toggling between receive and broadcast. And once you slap the ghost sticker on it, you also erase the politics and the tech. You stop asking, what does it mean for this world if will and history can literally be recorded, transmitted, censored? The poneglyphs turn from spooky rocks into hard drives for the Void Century. ancient weapons stop being big boomers and start looking a lot more like planet-scale transmitters and receivers. The final war stops being punch the government and starts reading as a fight over who controls the signal of reality itself. This is where the signal framing is just better vocabulary. If you think in terms of receivers, transmitters, and networks, suddenly Imu isn't just a shadow on a chair. Imu is a potential sysadmin of the planet's broadcast. The mother flame is not just a battery. It's a power source for whatever killed the original global network. Luffy's Gear 5 heartbeat? That becomes a literal broadcast ping, a login tone to an 800-year-old server the world government has been trying to unplug. And I need you to see what that does for you as a reader. When you adopt the signal vocabulary, you're not being a pattern-seeking monkey seeing Jesus in toast. You're actually respecting that the author planned this category of scenes as one continuous system. You're in the group that's engaging with intentional craft, not just farming low-effort, haha ghost radio memes for karma. This is not a sin. This is normal fandom behavior. We need to joke, we need to cope, this is fine. But if you stay in the ghost framing, you've basically opted out of the most interesting questions in the endgame. Because the moment you treat Luffy as an antenna instead of a medium, a much scarier possibility opens up. If there's a signal, there might also be someone on the other end, actively jamming it. And that someone on the other end is where the community's favorite coping mechanism kicks in, the 10D chess narrative. The moment things get scary or complicated, we slam the big red button that says, relax, Oda planned all of this from chapter 1. Any parallel, any echo, any panel that vaguely rhymes with an older panel becomes proof of omniscience. Roger hears the Sea Kings. Luffy hears the Sea Kings. Boom. Master plan. Galaxy brain. Here's the thing. When you turn Oda into a time-traveling supercomputer, you actually make his real craft less impressive. Because if everything was perfectly planned in 1997, then there's no risk, there's no adaptation, there's no, serialization forced me to pivot, so I'm going to retrofit this old gag into a trauma metaphor and pray it lands. You erase the part where an author has to wrestle the story week to week and still stick the landing. I need you to sit with the difference. Saying Oda always intended Luffy to be an antenna in a signal network is very different from saying Oda always intended Luffy to have a mysterious voice sense, and over time he refined that into a full communication system. In one version, he prints a 30-year tech Bible and just executes. In the other, he has a strong core concept and then keeps finding sharper, stranger, more thematically loaded ways to pay it off as the world expands. Think about the signal trail. Early on, hearing the voices of all things is basically a mysterious flavor text for Roger. Then Fishman Island mirrors it with Luffy and the Sea Kings. Zoo adds Zunesha with the twist that Momonosuke can transmit, not just receive. Wano throws in the Thousand Sunny's voice. Gear 5 frames his heartbeat itself as drums that the world can hear. That's not a static blueprint being photocopied for 25 years. That's an author retrofitting and escalating a loose wavelength idea into a full-blown network mythology. And listen to me, this is not a sin, this is normal. This is how good long-form writing works. You pre-write the big stuff, the ending, the void century, the will of D, and then you discover, on the page, that this ship can also be a node in the network that makes the theme of inherited will land harder. When fans flatten all of that into he planned it from day one, they think they're praising him, but they're actually sanding off all the evidence of ongoing craft. Pattern interrupt. If Oda really had every micro detail nailed in 1997, then what's your excuse? Why are you even trying to learn anything from his storytelling? You can't reverse engineer a miracle, that you can study a process. We need to start appreciating Oda as a craftsman in motion, not a static genius. Because if you can see where the pre-writing ends and the retrofitting begins, suddenly his choices around the signal system become actionable lessons. You can watch him take a vague voice category and slowly formalize rules, expand use cases, and tie it into technology, history, and theme. That's something you can steal. And if you care about storytelling at all, this matters. Learning to spot when something is genuine foreshadowing, when it's a retrofit, and when it's part of a broader pre-written spine will make you a sharper reader, a less delusional theorist, and, if you write, a more flexible author. Because once you stop worshipping 10D chess, you can start asking the real question. Where does the signal system go from here? And how is Oda still actively building it in real time? So, if there really is a signal system under the story, we need to talk about what happens when two people try to own the same frequency. Because at that point, the final saga stops being pirates punch government and turns into who gets admin rights on reality's Wi-Fi. Here's the thing. If the world actually runs on this hidden layer of will and information, then the real power isn't just blowing up islands, it's deciding who can log in, who can access, store, and broadcast on that layer at all. You don't just rule by guns and buster calls. You rule by muting entire categories of existence, erasing voices before they can even become history. That's the endgame Oda's been quietly foreshadowing. On one side, you have Luffy and his expanding community of weirdos, ghosts of nations, and walking embodiments of this is fine. They're the champions of a decentralized signal. Every island, every ship, every Sea King, every Zunesha gets to speak for itself. On the other side, you have Emu and the world government, the ultimate broadcast monopolists. One central tower, one curated feed, 800 years of there was no void century, there was no ancient kingdom, this is normal, go back to paying your heavenly tribute. Look at how the factions handle information. The poneglyphs are literally stone hard drives of recorded will, scattered across the sea, intentionally decentralized so no single authority can flip the off switch. The world government's response? Criminalize reading, erase O'Hara, then build a mother flame that can delete entire accounts from the map. This isn't just censorship, it's a full factory reset. So when we talk about the final war and the ancient weapons, I need you to stop picturing nukes and start picturing root access. What if Pluton, Uranus, and Poseidon aren't just continent busters but system tools? Poseidon already is. Shirahoshi can command Sea Kings, the literal backbone of the ocean network. Zunesha only moves when Momonosuke transmits. That's not a bomb, that's a god-tier admin panel. Imagine those weapons being activated not to vaporize the red line, but to reboot or overwrite the global network in favor of one side's will. Emu wants a clean install with no void sentry files. Luffy wants to restore every deleted voice from the recycle bin. And that's where Luffy's role gets way more specific than hit the final boss really hard. He's being built as a living antenna, the guy who hears Sea Kings, Zunesha, the Sunny, and then turns his own heartbeat into the drums of liberation. That's a broadcast. His job isn't just to topple Emu's tower. It's to reconnect the world so oppressed peoples, erased histories, and silenced wills can finally be heard without needing permission from Mariageoise's moderation team. Notice how that doesn't replace One Piece's core themes, it radicalizes them. Freedom stops being I do what I want and becomes everyone gets a channel. Inherited will stops being a sentimental phrase and becomes literal data persistence across centuries of attempted deletion. The sea, which has always been a metaphor for connection, turns into the original network cable running between islands, species, and eras. And Luffy? He's not a chosen messiah. He's the pattern-seeking monkey who accidentally turned himself into the world's loudest router, which raises the uncomfortable question the next section has to answer. If Luffy is broadcasting liberation, who exactly has been jamming the signal and how far does that interference go? And so if Luffy is the world's loudest router, listen to me. What happens if he yanks out the world government's Ethernet cable in real time? Picture Egghead, or Laugh Tale, or some final battle hellscape where the sky is already doing tax fraud. Luffy hits full gear 5, drums of liberation pounding, and instead of just clowning gravity, his signal spikes. Not metaphorically. I mean in the same literal sense that he and Roger heard Sea Kings, that he and Momonosuke heard Zunesha. Now imagine that wavelength, but dialed from weird tinnitus to planetary emergency alert. Here's the thing. If there is a suppressive field, some planned jamming broadcast that's been muting the world's voice for 800 years, Gear 5 is the first time we see Luffy's body casually overpower a systemic rule. He turns imagination into physics. So we need to ask what happens when that imagination is pointed at the network itself, when the rubber idiot decides, even unconsciously, that everyone should hear what he hears. Cut to a montage. In Alabasta, Vivi drops her microphone mid-speech, eyes wide, because she suddenly feels the crying of the dance powder wars. In Dressrosa, former toys clutch their heads as memories slam back in, not as flashbacks, but as a foreign signal syncing with their own will. On Fishman Island, the Sea King's whispers go from distant to deafening, and the kids who grew up under the prophecy suddenly understand the words. It's Conqueror's Haki, but rebranded as Everybody Gets Premium Access. This is not a sin. This is not bad power scaling. This is Oda paying off decades of foreshadowing about the voice of all things as a shared operating system. The difference is that instead of one chosen receiver, you get a forced firmware update for humanity. People don't just wake up. They wake up with context. The void century, the oppression, the erased islands, dumped into the collective inbox in one catastrophic push notification. Now fold in the ancient weapons. Pluton, Uranus, Poseidon have always read as nukes, but the author keeps framing them around control of the sea, the sky, the environment. Communication channels, if all three are actually giant transmitters receivers, then activating them in sync with Luffy's liberated signal gives you a global reset pulse that permanently rewires how will and information move. No more jamming, no more one-way propaganda. The planet itself becomes a poneglyph. Sounds great. Freedom Patch 1.0. Except, what if that change is irreversible? What if once every human can hear every scream, every grudge, every ancient sorrow, you don't get to turn the volume back down? That's the cost. Luffy isn't just breaking chains. He's potentially deleting the mute button from the settings menu forever. And this is where I need you to remember who we're talking about. This is still the guy who punches celestial dragons because they hurt his friends, whose entire political philosophy is, my crew eats meat together. The cosmic storytelling problem is that this very small, very specific desire for his people to be free scales up into rewriting the world's entire operating system without a rollback option. Oh, when that moment comes, when his drums can finally drown out the government's broadcast, the question isn't can he, it's does Luffy choose to make everyone hear everything? And the really uncomfortable part is, who might be standing there begging him not to flip that switch? So here's where this stops being a cute theory and becomes homework. Not school homework. Fun homework. I need you to actually go back and re-watch some stuff, because once you put on the signal glasses, whole arcs stop being random ghost whisper moments and start reading as a system the author has been quietly stress testing for decades. Here's the thing, you cannot just skip to Wano and go, wow, drums, we need to run the patch notes in order. Start at Logtown. That execution platform lightning bolt you've seen in 10,000 AMVs, watch that scene and keep asking, out loud if you have to, who's sending, who's receiving? What's the medium? Is this local haki or global signal? Is this just weather? Or did the world itself answer a will pointed straight at it? Then hit Skypiea. All the mantra stuff you used to file under early haki prototype, put it in the signal category for a second. When Enel is listening to every heartbeat on an island, is that just observation turned to 11? Or is he hijacking a broadcast tower that was always there? Same prompt. Who's sending, who's receiving? What's the medium, local, haki, or global signal? Pause. Rewind. Annoy your roommates. Eni's lobby next. Specifically the moment Luffy just knows Robin is still begging to be saved, even when he cannot see or hear her. You used to call that protagonist intuition. This is not a sin. This is normal. But now I want you to test the low-level ping reading. If the Sea Kings at Fishman Island can shout their fears into his skull, why wouldn't his own crewmates' will leak through when it's burning hot enough? Pattern interrupt. Jump to Sabaudi. All that I can feel they're still alive stuff after Kuma scatters the crew. You can either hand-wave that as genre convenience, or you can treat it as the author quietly standardizing the rules of a network before he names it. Again, run the prompt, who's sending, who's receiving? What's the medium? Is this just Luffy's optimism? Or is he passively listening to the same frequency Roger heard on that Oro Jackson prow? From there, go Fishman Island, Zoo, Wano, in a row. Sea Kings, Zunesha, the Thousand Sunnies, Voice, the drums of liberation. Watch them as iterations of one plan mechanic, not 4 separate magic tricks. And listen to me, if you are a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, this is fine. Make the corkboard, draw the red string, but discipline it with the foreshadow retrofit pre-write framework. So you are asking, could Oda have planned this? Instead of, do I emotionally want this to connect? Because if more of the community watched One Piece this way, discourse would get way less shallow and way more fun. We'd be mapping systems of storytelling, not just screaming power-scaling hot takes into the void. And once you start treating the signal as a real mechanic, not vibes, you're ready for the uncomfortable step, asking who else, besides Luffy, might already be using that network on purpose. So if we're done screaming Luffy hears dead people into the void, we need to talk about how you actually bring this into your day-to-day One Piece discourse. Because the theory is cute, but the way you talk about it will decide whether you're contributing to the community or just speedrunning brain rot. First thing, vocabulary. Words are categories, and categories are how your brain secretly cheats. If you keep calling it ghosts, your brain files the Sea Kings, Zanesha, the Sunny and the drums of liberation under spooky spirit nonsense, and stops thinking. I need you to start saying signal or voice of all things, and to mean it as a specific mechanic. Luffy isn't haunted, he's tuned. Roger isn't a medium, he's on the same wavelength. That tiny shift forces you to ask, okay, signal from what? To what? Through what? Instead of wow, Oda cooked again. Second vocabulary tweak while we're here. Stop dumping every cool connection into the single bucket of Oda planned this 25 years ago. Here's the thing. There is a difference between planned setup and smart retrofit, and if you care about writing, you should care which is which. Laboon and Brook, planned setup. Oda has literally said he designed them as a pair. Zunisha's crime tying into Wano's history, that smells more retrofit. An earlier weird elephant detail given sharper meaning once Wano solidified. This is not a sin. This is fine. And this is normal. But say the category you're praising. Don't hand-wave the author's actual craft. Now, theory posting. I need you to retire the Oda confirmed this in chapter 3 inches voice, unless Oda actually, physically, with his human mouth. Name your posts as, here's a pattern I see, not, this was always the intent. The one sentence of humility gives you room to be wrong without having to delete your account when a new SBS drops and punts your galaxy brain into the ocean. And if you're going to make big claims about intent, post your receipts, panels, SBS pages, interview links. You say, Oda always meant the voice of all things to be a global broadcast? Cool. Show me the Fishman Island Roger / Luffy parallel. Show me Zoo. Show me the Sunny in Wano. We are all pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast. Citation culture is how you separate, I noticed a neat echo, from this is structurally supported foreshadowing. Underneath all of this is a mindset shift. Curiosity over certainty. The fun stance is, here's a coherent model that fits the evidence so far. Not, I solved One Piece, everyone else is dumb. The first invites people to add panels, poke holes, refine the model. The second just invites quote retweets, and here's the payoff. Adopting this more rigorous approach is an in-group badge. You're not just a consumer of hype, you're an engaged reader of a once-in-a-generation story. You're the person who doesn't just yell Nika foreshadowing, but can walk someone through how the signal shows up, evolves, and slots into Oda's pre-written endgame. That's the club, that's the jersey. Because once you start talking this way, you're ready for the next uncomfortable question. If Luffy is picking up a signal, who's actually running the network? And what happens when someone tries to hijack it? So let's pull the camera back for a second, because at this point we need to see the whole wiring diagram, not just individual blinking LEDs. The core thesis of this entire rant is simple. Luffy is not hearing ghosts. He's not having random anime empathy moments. He is picking up and eventually broadcasting a structured signal that connects wills, history, and leftover ancient tech into one global network the world government has been desperately trying to jam for 800 years. Once you hold that in your head, all the categories we've talked about snap into place. Foreshadowing is the stuff that was clearly intentionally set up for this signal model from day one. Roger hearing the Sea Kings at Fishman Island, Odin reacting to the same voice, the parallel panels with Luffy later doing it again. That isn't coincidence. That's the author quietly telling you, this is the same system, this is the same account logging. Then you've got pre-writing. Here's the thing. The voice of all things isn't some late invention. Oda committed to that term, that power, that mystery before page 1. So when we see poneglyphs described as recorded voices, or Laughtale framed as the place where all that information converges, that's not him improvising a metaphor. That's him slowly revealing a network architecture he already diagrammed in a notebook, while the rest of us were still pattern-seeking monkeys, seeing Jesus in the Going Mary's figurehead. And retrofitting. This is not the sin. This is fine. This is normal. And Sunny speaking to Luffy in Wano. The ship's spirit slotting into the same category as Sea Kings and Zunisha. That's Oda taking an emotional beat he always loved and snapping it onto the existing signal model. He doesn't break the rules. He backfills them. The result is that fans feel a spooky consistency even when the plumbing was installed a little later. When you reframe it as a network, the roles are clean. Receivers are people tuned to this frequency. Luffy, Roger, Momonosuke, Oden. Transmitters are the big mythic nodes. Joy Boy Laker, Poseidon and the Sea Kings. The ancient weapons, maybe even the world's voice itself. Relays and storage are the infrastructure. Poneglyphs as hard drives of will. Zunisha as a walking server rack. Laughtale as the final data center where the whole broadcast makes sense. And that leads straight into the endgame. The final war isn't just ships and lasers. It's a fight over who owns the broadcast. IMU is running a suppression signal, erasing islands, censoring history, using Mother Flame as a giant off switch for inconvenient voices. Luffy, with Gear 5 and those drums of liberation, is the opposite. A living antenna whose heartbeat is a jailbreak code, forcing the whole planet back onto the original network, whether the government wants it or not. So, listen to me. Whether every tiny detail was perfectly planned or some of it was smart retrofitting, the fact that this signal metaphor holds from Fishman Island to Wano to Laughtale is not an accident. It's evidence of an author treating his story as a design system, not a haunted house. The community slapping lol ghosts on that's underselling the craft. Because if Luffy is an antenna and the world is a network, the next question is brutal. What happens when the network finally runs at full power and some people get permanently disconnected? So if the world is running on this hidden network, we need to talk about the guy who built the router. Or at least, the guy who's been maintaining it for 25 years without the whole thing catching fire. Because listen to me, it is insanely rare for a series this long to keep one coherent mystery system alive. The voices Luffy hears at Fishman Island, the Sea Kings echoing Roger, Zunisha in Zoo, the Sunny in Wano, the drums of liberation in Onigashima. That is the same signal, deployed over decades, without Oda tripping over his own wires. Most long runners can't keep a haircut consistent across 2 arcs. But here's the thing, I don't think that means Oda is some infallible prophet with a corkboard of every single panel mapped from day one. The real genius is weirder and honestly more impressive. His superpower is flexibility. He takes early motifs, voices, wills, weapons, and keeps reinterpreting them in a way that feels intentional, that folds new information in without breaking the old scenes. That's not guessing the future. That's extremely disciplined retrofitting inside a pre-planned frame. Example, Skypia's mantra. Early on, it reads as this vaguely spiritual sixth sense. Years later, it's absorbed into Haki, which then gets braided into Conquerors, which then gets braided into Luffy's Gear 5 drums, literally shaking the world. The category keeps expanding, but the story never has to apologize for what it said before. This is not a sin. This is how good long-form writing survives contact with serialization. Now, I need you to resist the urge to turn that into worship. When the community treats Oda as a perfect all-knowing god of foreshadowing, 2 bad things happen. First, any inconsistency gets hand-waved as we just don't get it yet, which kills interest in critique. Second, we stop actually reading. He is clearly an author who wants you to think. He leaves puzzles. He tells you in SBS that something's changed. He jokes about forgotten details. Treating him as untouchable is the opposite of what his storytelling invites. On the flip side, pure cynicism. It's all random, he's just making it up week to week. Doesn't survive contact with the text. The voice of all things keeps showing up in very specific, mirrored ways. Roger and Luffy hearing the same Sea Kings. Luffy and Momo sharing Zunesha's signal but with different permissions. Ancient weapons framed as world-shaking voices of the sea and earth. You don't accidentally improvise a consistent communication metaphor for 1,000 chapters. This is normal pattern recognition, not me being a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. So the middle path is this. Oda is a working artist under brutal deadlines, operating inside a pre-written endgame, constantly massaging early pieces to serve a clearer version of the story he already knows. Not a god, not a hack. A guy doing extremely smart, intentional problem solving in public. And when you view the signal through that lens, its coherence becomes more impressive, not less. Because once you admit the network is real and designed, you have to ask a much uglier question. If the system is that intentional, what else has been quietly plugged into it that we haven't recognized yet? So here's where I need you to do a tiny brain reset. Up to now, we've been treating the signal as this hidden network Oda built into the world. Cool, impressive, very galaxy brain. But listen to me, that network is useless without hardware, and Luffy, especially post-Gear 5, is the world's stupidly cheerful cell tower. Restate this in your head. His body and his will are not just strong, they're tuned. It's not a guy who occasionally hears ghosts when the plot needs pathos. He's a living broadcast tower that just happens to punch people. The Sea Kings at Fishman Island, Zunesha on Zoo and in Wano, the Sunny in Onigashima, even those drums of liberation themselves. Those are all moments where the antenna spikes and you see the bars fill. Now, here's the thing. Being an antenna is only half the joke, because the more you stack these scenes, the more it stops sounding mystical and starts sounding technical. Luffy is basically the world's long-delayed firmware update. Joy Boy 1.0 shipped 800 years ago. The world government hard crashed the system, and ever since then the planet has been running on corrupted software and copium. Every inherited will thread, that's patch notes. Whitebeard's speech at Marineford, the D carriers scattered across the seas, rebellions from Alabasta to Dressrosa to Wano. Those aren't random coincidences the community overhypes as foreshadowing. They're queued downloads. Features and bug fixes that have been patiently sitting in the backlog, waiting for someone with the right privileges to finally hit install. And Luffy as Nika, as Joy Boy's successor, or reincarnation or whatever category you want to put him in, is the user account with admin rights. That's why when he laughs, the world laughs with him, and when he falls, everyone's Wi-Fi cuts out for a second. The story isn't just he inherited their dreams. It's their dreams were literal data packets, and his body is the only machine that can unpack the file without exploding. Pattern interrupt. The drums of liberation are not just a cool soundtrack, they're the loading bar noise. That relentless, goofy, irresistible rhythm is the audible sign that the patch is finally installing, whether the world government likes it or not. The Gorosei hearing those drums? That's the IT department, realizing the forbidden update they tried to delete is somehow at 73% and they can't find the cancel button. So we need to retire the Luffy hears ghosts headcanon. This is not a sin. This is normal fan behavior. I also am a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. But from now on, every time you reread a signal scene, Sea King, Zunesha, the Sunny, the voice of all things, I need you to mentally swap in, the world is buffering its patch through this idiot. Because once you do that, a lot of future endgame problems stop being mystery magic and start being who's trying to hijack the update, which is where this gets much uglier. And if you've stuck around through me calling your favorite rubber boy a walking firmware update for the planet, yeah, I have news for you. You are not a casual fan anymore. Listen to me. Normal people do not spend 2 hours listening to some stranger on the internet rant about invisible pirate Wi-Fi, packet loss in the voice of all things, and whether the Sea Kings are basically underwater routers. This is not a drive-by watch. This is a lifestyle choice. Here's the thing. Once you've gone this deep, you don't get to pretend you're just watching for the fights in front of your friends. You now have a whole vocabulary and framework in your head. You have signal as a category. You can point at Fishman Island and say, that's not ghosts, that's the network pinging Luffy. You can point at Zunatia and say, that's not prophecy, that's a forced remote command. You are now tragically overqualified to be that person in the group chat. The one who shows up when someone posts a panel of Luffy hearing the Sunny and goes, actually, that's not ghosts. That's the signal bleeding through the hull. This is not a sin. This is how a community evolves. Someone has to be the annoying friend who knows what foreshadowing actually is and will die on that hill. So I need you to use that power. Drop your own examples in the comments. What scenes did I miss that fit the Luffy is an antenna model? Is there a random cover story where a turtle hears a tone and you've been screaming about it for 5 years? Tell me. Argue with me. If you think I'm overfitting the pattern, call me out and bring an example where the signal explanation breaks. We need to stress test this, not treat it as sacred scripture. And if you're sitting there thinking, no one I know will care about this, you're wrong. You have at least one friend who keeps saying Oda planned everything from chapter 1, don't worry about it. Or, on the other end, it's just magic, stop overthinking, every single week. Send them this as a gentle intervention. Hey, I found a 2-hour video that will either validate you or ruin your day. This is fine. This is normal. Because if this does numbers, I'm not stopping at Ghost Wi-Fi. We're going to do the same forensic autopsy on the D-lineage as a planned narrative device, not a vague destiny buzzword. We're going to talk about the moon tech, the ancient communication infrastructure, how much of Laugh Tale's reveal is already quietly written in the margins. The signal is just one system under the surface. If you want the full operating manual for this story, I need you to tell me in the comments, and I need you to stick around for the next deep dive. So let's land this. We started with Luffy hears ghosts, and I need you to walk away with that file permanently deleted. Luffy is not a ghost whisperer. He's the main character of a story about will, history, and communication, and those voices are Oda handing you the user interface for the world's hidden operating system. Sea Kings at Fishman Island, Zunatia on Zoo, the Thousand Sunny crying out in Wano, the drums of liberation shaking the sky. This is one category, one sense, one signal. When Roger laughs at the Sea Kings the same way Luffy does decades later, that's not a spooky coincidence. That's the author flashing the "this is intentional, pay attention" sign in neon. Here's the thing. When you swap ghosts for signal, you stop treating these scenes as vague spiritual garnish, and you start treating them as foreshadowing for a planned endgame mechanic. A signal has rules. A signal has a sender and a receiver. Suddenly you can ask real questions. Is Zunatia just talking, or also pinging an ancient network? Is Luffy's Gear 5 heartbeat a broadcast that other receivers can tune into? You can argue that, predict with it. You can be wrong in interesting ways instead of just going, woo, mysterious. And this is not a sin. This is not bad fandom. This is in fact how most good story discussion works. We need to move from pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast to reader who understands the difference between a random cloud shape and a radio tower. The poneglyphs are recorded, Will. The ancient weapons are probably transmitters and receivers. The Void Century is an age where this whole network got wiped. Luffy hearing the world is not fate, it is hardware. So here's my playful threat. Next time a chapter drops and Luffy hears something impossible, you are not allowed to tweet spooky or ghosts unless you at least ask out loud, who is sending this and who is receiving it? Is it the world's voice? Is it Emu trying to jam the frequency? Is it the Sea Kings picking up the drums of liberation and relaying them across the globe? If you do not show your work, I am issuing you a light-hearted citation. If this reframed anything for you, I need you to do the boring YouTube ritual. Hit like so the algorithm knows the signal exists. Subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive on the moon tech and the communication grid. Then seriously rewatch an Arc Fishman Island Zoo, Wano, with this lens on. Ask where the signal is, who's talking, who's deaf, who's pretending not to hear. The more people in the community who are on the same wavelength, the better the conversation gets. We needed to have this conversation. Now go listen to the story Oda is actually telling you, not the one you've lazily filed under ghost stuff, because the signal is only getting louder from here.